Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 312. It's the last Sunday in August, so that means it's the Patreon Drydock. So everybody buckle in because there's a lot of questions to answer. Nosdormu89 asks, in the Titanic movie, when full astern is ordered, they had to raise the steam pressure in the boilers to reverse the engines. Why, and how did shutting the dampers help? So there's actually fairly minimal enhancements, if you like, for the movie, because they actually used a Liberty ship working vertical triple expansion engine for this section of the filming. So it is quite realistic. Now, the reason they had to raise steam pressure in the boilers when they were reversing the engines and why they were shutting dampers, it's all to do with the procedure to reverse the vertical triple expansion engines in an emergency. So the first thing they have to do is close the throttle, which is reduce the amount of steam that's actually going to the engines. That's why you see the steam pressure gauge fall off. Because although in theory you could use the little hydraulic reversing engine to slam the linkage over and immediately start pouring steam at full pressure into the engine and trying to get it to reverse, that's a huge amount of energy when the engine's bolting along at full power in forward, which is what it was doing before, to essentially put that amount of energy into trying to get it to go into reverse. It might not even work. The inertia involved might actually overcome your steam injection, which would be very, very bad, and it very likely could cause colossal damage to the engines. So you want to reduce the amount of resistance that the engine's going to put up to being suddenly tried to move in reverse, hence the pressure drops off, which of course then means that when you want to get the engines to go into reverse, once you've successfully engaged reverse, you have to bring the pressure back up again, and of course because it's an emergency you have to do that fairly quickly. The dampers are a colloquial term, as far as I understand it, for essentially the valves that control the throttle. So when they're saying close the dampers, what he means is you're cutting off the supply of steam from the boilers to the engines, hence the drop in pressure. And then, of course, you engage the reverse. And because if you watch that scene through several times, you'll notice that they're still at about 100 psi when they engage reverse. And that's why you get this little bit where there's a massive jolt as the inertia of the pistons going round and round meets with the steam pressure and the linkage moving over, which is now basically saying, well, we want to go in the opposite direction. And then, of course, once you've established that the engine is in fact going in the opposite direction, then you raise the steam pressure as much as possible. Now, of course, there is a whole debate as to whether or not the engines were put in reverse or even stopped before Titanic hit the iceberg, but that's rather not really here nor there. The movie shows this happening, and the question is about why is this procedure done in the movie. So, two separate things, like how this procedure is done versus what may or may not have actually happened that night in 1912. And just as a little side note, the reason I chose this particular part of the scene to screen cap is that massive jolt. Yeah, as an engineer and a naval historian, that's scary. Because yes, it would have happened if the engines were brought to a halt in preparation for emergency reverse. That is not a sound you want to hear, because that is the sound of several hundred tons of steel moving at very high speed coming to a sudden and complete halt. Rather disturbingly close to anybody who's close enough to hear it. And yeah, even with the pressure reduced through closing the throttle, the stresses involved are immense. That is the kind of sound where if you hear it, well, if several seconds have passed and you're still alive, this is good. But when you hear it the moment that you do, there is a non-zero chance you may not be hearing all that much subsequently, ever. Miko Leitner asks, can you give us an overview of the naval career of Robert Falcon Scott? And if you had to assume, what kind of service could have been expected of him during World War I had he survived his Antarctic expedition, given his rank and expertise? Scott initially joined the Royal Navy at the beginning of the 1880s in Dartmouth, or HMS Britannia, passing out as a cadet, then becoming a midshipman, and the early part of his career was then spent in the Southern Atlantic and general southern stations aboard a series of small corvettes and later renamed cruisers. He proved to be a fairly able officer, so when he went for his sub-lieutenant exams, he got 4 out of 5 first-class certificates. So there were 5 exams, and each exam that you passed at this period of time, you could get a first, second, or third-class certificate. So you might call it A, B, or C these days. As you'll have noted from some of the other Royal Navy officers that we've been doing biographies on the channel, like Admiral Cunningham, some of them would get 5 out of 5. Scott got 4 out of 5 first class. He still passed the 5th one, so he was good. He wasn't absolutely top of his league, but he was still pretty darn good. And by the end of the 19th century, he had reached lieutenant, full lieutenant, and had had his first command, although he did manage to run a torpedo boat aground. And he only briefly served on anything of particular size in terms of frontline combat capability right towards the very end of the 19th century, as it turned into the 20th. In the first half of the 1900s, he was off on an Antarctic expedition, which obviously took him out of general naval circulation, but it was successful enough that by the second half of the 1900s, he was placed in command of a series of pre-dreadnought battleships. Then, of course, towards the end of the 1900s, he went off on the expedition that would kill him. Now, if he survived that, there are 2 main potential options. Firstly, obviously, that he may have been too crippled by frostbite and so forth to continue in naval service, in which case he would just be given an honourable retirement, and that would be pretty much that, or maybe a desk job would be found for him. However, if we assume that the weather was a little bit kinder and a few circumstances that went against the expedition didn't go against them quite as badly, and you end up with Scott surviving the expedition pretty well intact, then, well, even though he would have been second, he would still have reached South Pole, and that would have accelerated his star even further. Given his position before he went off, and the fact you don't actually have too long until the First World War breaks out, I suspect he would have been placed in command of one of the dreadnoughts of the Grand Fleet. There wasn't a particularly large call for Antarctic exploration expertise in the First World War, which of course means that Scott probably would have been at Jutland in command of one of the ships in Jellicoe's fleet. The reason why I say he probably wouldn't end up in a cruiser squadron or in the battle cruisers, the battle cruisers are a very plumb position, and Scott's recent command experience was in battleships, not in armoured cruisers or the early battle cruisers. So it would be more likely that he would be given command of a battleship. And, of course, similarly, because his command experience is in capital ships, leadership of a cruiser squadron, whilst possible, is less likely. There is, of course, the slight possibility he might have been in charge of one of 5th Battle Squadron's Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, in which case he would technically have been in the battle cruiser fleet, but nonetheless, I think that's roughly where he would have ended up. ACC asks, fresh water is the most important resource for any long journey. In the age of sail, I assume no one wanted to let rainwater go to waste, and that many ships and or navies came up with more creative ways to collect it than just ineffectually sticking open barrels up on the top deck when a storm came through. What were some of the most common collection tactics used across the board, and if applicable, what were your favourite oddball engineering solutions for collecting rainwater that never really caught on? Well, unfortunately, it seems like there weren't too many cases of people deliberately trying to invent specific ways of collecting rainwater, because a ship collecting rainwater to resupply itself, whilst not necessarily uncommon, wasn't common either, because ships generally tended to carry quite a large amount of water and beer and other liquids aboard, to the point that if you began to run seriously short, well, A, something had already gone very, very wrong because you should have planned to have a surplus, and B, considering that a lot of the time ships would be somewhere near coasts or islands, it was held to be better to just pull into one of those and resupply. But if you were on a long voyage or the weather had really turned against you for whatever reason, you couldn't get ashore, then if you look through all the various accounts of how people did collect rainwater when they absolutely needed to, it all seems to be pretty much on the same theme, at least for the age of sail. It gets a bit different once you get to iron ships and so forth, but in the age of sail, what they tended to do was break out sheets, perhaps spare bits of sailcloth, etc., and set them up as a kind of awning. Now, any of you who have had a tent or a gazebo or an awning set up in a rainstorm will know exactly what happens. Obviously, these days they're very waterproof, but if it's at any kind of angle, water will run off. But unless it's at an incredible amount of tension, water will pool, and then you end up having to poke it and push it to dump out large amounts of water. So what they were doing was essentially this, but deliberately setting up whole sections of sheeting and sailcloth and really anything that they could get their hands on, and as the water would run down it, they would keep one end slightly slack to form a natural V, and the water would run down that into casks or barrels, whatever it was they happened to have available to store said water, and then that water would be obviously taken below to be stored to be drunk later on. Now, there are a few caveats to this, one of which is, of course, that if your ship has been at sea for prolonged periods of time, then pretty much every exposed surface is going to have a slight incrustation of salt. So unless you're extremely desperate, what you would want to do when rain comes is let the rain first wash off some of that salt first. Otherwise, you're going to be collecting just mild saline solution, which is not really good to drink. And of course, in a lot of serious rainstorms, you've also actually got a full storm going, so wind and spray and the ship pitching and everything, which will result in a lot of salt spray being in the air anyway. So ideally what you want is a lot of rain and minimal storm, but which also will mean if there's relatively minimal strong winds, you'll also be able to deploy the sails, because obviously in very, very strong winds, you'd be pulling in most of your sails. But if the wind isn't particularly strong, then if you've got your sails out, then obviously once they've had a little bit of time to desalinate, then you're not going to try and reposition the entire sail to direct its water into one particular area, but water will naturally run down sails, at which point you could have your collecting sheets underneath them to focus the water a bit more. And depending on the amount of rain, the duration, the weather conditions associated with it, etc., people record collecting anything from a few small casks up to several dozen large barrels worth of water, essentially down to those factors and how many sheets they had. Brian Stevens asks, if you were writing a book and had to plan the ideal rise of an officer in the Royal Navy in the age of sail, what would it look like? Okay, so realistically, in the age of sail, if you want an officer to rise quickly and ideally, you want him to start out service with some form of patronage, a relatively decent amount, not massive, because if you're the son of a well-known lord or a high-ranking politician or a very high-ranking admiral, people are going to know about that and they're going to assume that you're rising because of patronage rather than on your own merits. But if you've got connections, let's say, in the administration element of the Admiralty, or perhaps your father or uncle is a high-ranking captain, commodore, or rear admiral, something like that, some kind of mid-level patronage, so that'll help grease the wheels where necessary. Of course, you need to be relatively intelligent as well, and get your midshipmen's posting nice and early when you're just about entering your teens. You'd want initial midshipmen's service on a big ship of the line, because there'd be plenty of people to learn from, and if you're not particularly brilliant at one thing or another and you just need to pick up a few more lessons, it's not going to massively impact the running of the ship. But after a short amount of time, 6, 12 months or something, you pretty much want to get transferred to a smaller ship, a brig, a sloop, frigate, something like that, where there's fewer midshipmen, and now you've got your sea legs under you, you've got more of an opportunity to stand out. Especially on a frigate, because a frigate statistically is probably the most likely to see action. So now that you're a senior midshipman and angling towards your lieutenant's exam, you ideally would have your frigate engage in several combats, whether they just be capturing of enemy merchant ships or maybe the pursuit and taking of a small enemy warship. This would allow your midshipmen to distinguish themselves in boarding actions, being very courageous, handling the ship's boats correctly when moving crew across to take the thing as a prize, this kind of thing. That will get you noticed, which together with your patronage will hopefully get you through your lieutenant's exam. Obviously, you have to, again, by being relatively intelligent, be able to study for it as well. So you're now a commissioned lieutenant, and you have a reasonable degree of success behind you. You probably still want to stay in frigates because you will be relatively high up the command chain at that point. And again, frigates see quite a bit of action, and even if they don't see action, they can do other interesting things like exploration and blockade and reconnaissance and scouting and the kinds of things that allow you to make a name for yourself. That's probably where you'd want to stay as you move through and on up the ranks. And then I think you've got two paths which could both equally lead to distinguishment, or at least fairly easy distinguishment, which would either be to be given command of an unrated ship like a sloop or a brig as a senior lieutenant, or potentially stick around as the first lieutenant on a frigate. Obviously, first lieutenant on a frigate is a slightly subordinate position, but a largish frigate, a sixth rate, a fifth rate, a rated vessel is perhaps more likely to get a bit more notoriety. Whereas if you are completely in command of a brig or a sloop, then obviously you get all the credit, but you have a ship that is physically less capable. Of course, if you're someone like Cochrane, that doesn't necessarily mean all that much, and you can still go around nabbing enemy frigates and so forth. But realistically, you're likely to see bigger actions on the frigate, but get less of the credit, and get all the credit, but see smaller actions in the brig or the sloop. But either way, assuming you don't get hit by a cannonball or something, you can make a reasonable active name for yourself in either one of those things, in scouting, boarding, dispatch, convoy escort, convoy defense, blockade, etc., etc. Once you've been advanced to captain, however, assuming that you want to get all the way up into being an admiral, then you really want to start perhaps looking at moving up in the world in terms of ships. So rather than a small frigate, you'd want at least a large frigate, so a large fifth rate, maybe a 38 gunner, or perhaps one of the 50 gunner or 64 gunners, a fourth rate or a small third rate, because those ships are bigger, more powerful, but also still likely to be found in independent action. There is a chance that you could find yourself in a fairly major action like the Leander at the Battle of the Nile, and that still gives you an opportunity to distinguish yourself, because whilst all the bigger ships are going to be held in the battle line, as a smaller vessel, you're not necessarily going to be expected to conform just the same as everybody else, but offering support here and there would be more forgivable. And of course, if ships get in distress, you can go and assist them, pretty much, again, like Leander at the Battle of the Nile. And if you do get stuck in properly, people are going to appreciate that more if you're in a 50 gunner or a 64 in a battle of 74s and 80s, because, hey, well, this ship's much smaller, much less heavily armed, and it's fighting just as hard as everybody else, if not possibly harder. And of course, with a small crew, there's a better chance that you can train them to be expert gunners and so forth. Then you'd want to move up to command a proper ship, so a 74 gunner or above. And now it comes down a lot to luck because, okay, 74s, the third rates, did see a certain degree of independent action, so you could potentially get fame and fortune there. But the Royal Navy in the classic age of sail also spends a fair bit of time on blockade duty, which is why a lot of officers preferred frigate duty. So it really, if you're writing your ideal rise in a book and you have narrative control of it, you could either go with you're assigned to a third rate, but you get to lead independent operations or even just be on independent operation, maybe with one or two smaller ships, and pursue and track down other enemy vessels, defend convoys and so forth. Or you could be on a first, second or third rate and luck out and be centerpiece to a really big engagement, a 20, 30, 40 plus ship on each side set piece battle. Essentially, what you're looking for in each stage of your career is obviously fulfilling your duties properly, but also having some kind of regular adversary to overcome, whether that be like really severe weather, overcoming enemy fortifications, overcoming enemy ships, which would be the most common and also most profitable because of prize money, or an outnumbered defense of enemy shipping. So let's say you're in a 50 gunner doing convoy escort. If you're set upon by 3 or 4 enemy frigates or an enemy 74 and you manage to hold those enemies off long enough for the convoy to escape or potentially even sink or take the enemy, that's going to, even though it's a defensive action, probably get you just as much, if not more, acclaim as if you're on independent service and you manage to track down and take an enemy frigate almost intact. And then once you reach flag rank, it's just down to hope there's some nice big battles for you to lead somewhere. Jonathan Smith asks, I was wondering, if Warspite had actually been saved as a museum, how practical would it have been to keep her long-term in her D-Day state? Disabled turret, concrete hull patches, etc., etc. As you talked about repairing her hull plates in a recent Drydock episode, I started thinking about how interesting it would have been for a tour to visit the Fritz X damage and the inside of the concrete patches and talk about all the repairs that let her get rushed back to support D-Day. As a museum ship long term, I don't think, unfortunately, that would be entirely practical. Mostly because, as people like the chaps who run USS Texas will tell you, concrete and hull steel do not mix on a long-term basis. Well, I can tell you that as an engineer as well, but people with a practical experience definitely will be able to tell you that. With that said, I think preserving X turret in its disabled state definitely could be a thing, as long as you make sure it's kept watertight. As far as the hull patches go, I think the best compromise would probably be similar to what USS Massachusetts down at Battleship Cove has done with their damage, which is obviously it's been repaired since and it's been plated over. But what they've done for the museum ship is they've actually highlighted where the damage was, including splinter damage, with red paint. So it's all outlined. And they've made it an element of the tour and kept, bits and pieces of the actual damaged material around where possible. So, you could make it a highlighted part of the tour, but plate over the actual damage with steel, remove the concrete, but then you could keep elements of the concrete and any other bits and pieces as part of the tour, up on stands and pedestals, etc. And perhaps, depending on what resources you've got when you're initially setting the ship up, some of the internal concrete patches could remain because they'd be less susceptible to water infiltration compared to the external and deck patches. And possibly, if you're feeling really, really artistic, and to absolutely minimize any interaction between it and the steel, would be to maybe roughly remove the internal patches eventually and remount them using rebar, so that you'd have the hole, assuming it's not massively structurally compromising, you'd have the hole in the hull internally where the Fritz X has passed through, with a rebar grid or partial grid that's extending into that void so that visitors can look down and see through where it goes, but the majority of the hull is still occupied with part of the original concrete patch just chipped away a little bit. I think that would actually work quite well. But anything where it's exposed constantly to moisture, like I say, decking, the upper deck or the hull, you definitely want to replace those concrete patches entirely. Greb asks, let's see that Bofors catalogue you mentioned, please. Well, of course, the glorious answer to that particular question is which one? Because I have 5 from different eras. Oh, it's great. In any case, I picked this one, which is kind of an intermediate one. It's one of the earlier ones, but it's a little bit easier to handle. Some of the other earlier ones have cardboard covers, which are a little bit fragile to handle these days. This one has a kind of a faux leather plastic cover, but it's still a very early one. The 2 later ones are sort of 1930s, 1940s. And whilst admittedly this particular one is perhaps a little bit more sparse on the details compared to the others, as I said, A, it's easier to photograph relatively quickly, and B, it's still remarkable as a book. So you open with this wonderful, nice fold-out photo of the Bofors factory in Karlskoga. And then the first thing they do before they try and sell you anything is show you pictures of the factory. In this case, obviously, this is the gun shops. And just to note, every photograph with its facing page, the facing page is actually of this very transparent material, which A, cuts down on the weight and the thickness of the book. And as you'll see in a second, when I flip the page, as well as giving you a little bit of a teaser as to what you're about to see, over time, and I'm pretty sure this wasn't intentional, but over time, as you can see here, as the celluloid has very slightly leached onto the, I guess, tracing paper you'd call it, you've got this sort of reverse image ghost that's forming on the cover page, which is also a really cool effect. And then you get into the main part of the catalogue, which has, obviously, being Bofors, lots and lots of different guns. So this is a 24cm disappearing carriage, full cupolas for installation in coastal defence fortifications, and as you can see from the picture in the factory, they've got a whole load of them ready to go. Also, actually, a really good idea of what a coastal defence cupola turret looks like in full before they bury it. Here's another 24cm gun, or roughly 9.4 inch, but this time, as you can see, it's in a naval turret carriage. So obviously they haven't built the gun house over the top of it, but they will sell you a 9.4 inch naval gun. But this being Bofors, they won't just sell you the gun, they can sell you the whole ship. Here's an advertisement for a stern post for a coastal defence ship that they're building. And it's not just about selling you the hardware, they'll also show you the results of their wares. So there's a whole section at the back, because obviously I'm only showing you highlighted pages, but yeah, as it says, here's a block of cast nickel steel with a bunch of shots they've shot at it, all numbered and tabulated both in the photo and on the page. And here's a plate of Krupp steel that they've shot a bunch of projectiles at as well. And there's actually a very similar plate still standing, actually in the Nobel estate, which is right next to the Bofors factory in Karlskoga, which is a variant on this. It's just been hit by 12-inch gunfire instead of 6-inch in this case. HMS Vanguard 46 asks, how effective were bow rudders? First of all, this picture that you're seeing on screen at the moment, courtesy of the Dreadnought Project. Go and check them out. Really good, really seriously good website for naval historians. The reason I'm showing you this is because this shows an example of a warship with a bow rudder. This is a German destroyer, or at least a plan of one, from, as you might be able to tell from the design, the early part of the 20th century. And it actually has bow rudders stuck all the way up there in the front, and they are retractable ones. So as the answer goes on, you're going to be zooming in closer and closer so you can see them more effectively. Now, bow rudders in and of themselves are generally not particularly effective, at least if you're trying to go forward. A lot of the water redirection that they create is immediately nullified by the bow and then the rest of the ship coming through right behind it. They actually have a slight counter turning effect compared to what you'd actually want. They cause you a little bit more to slip more than turn, although you will eventually turn. And one of the few ways of actually dealing with that is to have the rudder extend below the keel line of the ship. That, of course, increases your overall draft, which on big ships isn't really a good idea. On this particular ship, as you can see, they're retracted, but once they're extended, they will go beneath the keel, which actually obviates a lot of the problems with bow rudders. But obviously for something like a few hundred tons of torpedo boat, this is possible. For something like 10, 20, 30, 40,000 tons of capital ship, you need such a large and powerful rudder anyway, with powerful steering mechanisms. Whether or not you can even fit the steering mechanisms in the bow in the first place, you have to have some pretty hefty volume in your bow taken up by them for a relatively minor effect. Now, that all holds true in the general case for bow rudders. However, there are a couple of reasons you might want one. Firstly, if you expect to be doing a fair amount of maneuvering going astern, then of course, if you start heading backwards, your bow is now your stern, and a bow rudder is actually now considerably more effective and useful for you. So an example of that might be US Navy interwar carriers, like the Yorktowns, where they were thinking about perhaps operating them in reverse if they got damaged, if the flight deck got damaged. So now consideration about high reverse speed and potential bow rudders to help maneuver become viable. For if you've got a ship that's going to have to do a lot of its own maneuvering into port, then reversing up to a quayside, a bow rudder might be quite useful in those kinds of circumstances. And although they're not the world's most effective rudders for normal forward momentum, they are still better than nothing. So if you're designing a ship with extreme redundancy in mind for damage control and so forth, especially in the wake of some instance like with Bismarck or Prince of Wales, then you might think of putting bow rudders in and just accepting the volume and weight penalties for something that you hopefully will never need to use, because in the event that you do need to use it, obviously having a set of rudders in the bow, as relatively speaking ineffectual as they might be, will potentially still come and save you if all your steering mechanisms astern have been destroyed. So in general terms, bow rudders are not particularly effective, but in certain very specific circumstances, usually when it comes to warships emergency circumstances, they can be exceptionally useful, to the point that they're one of those things of, in some designs, you might consider that it's better to have it and never need it than end up needing it and not having it because of the potential consequences thereof. The one-man Kiyoshi Kakawa fan club asks, Japanese pilot training has been fairly notorious lately for its high washout rate, but some of the anecdotes about it, including the use of palm reading to wash out potential pilots, gave me the feeling the Japanese military simply did not have enough aircraft for all their pilots, so they had to wash out an inordinate amount of potential recruits. Was this the case, and if so, how much does low aircraft production actually justify this training regimen? The Japanese certainly weren't short of aircraft. I mean, if you look at their production figures, okay, they're not the highest amongst the World War II powers by a long way, but they were still churning out multiple thousands of aircraft, even in the years before they were actually in World War II, and therefore obviously had to ramp production up somewhat. And by the end of the war, they had many more aircraft than they had pilots or fuel to put in them, albeit most of them were looking at making one-way kamikaze runs just off their coast in anticipation of the Allied invasion. So at that point, you didn't need a full tank. You could split a full tank between half a dozen aircraft. But nonetheless, the supply of aircraft certainly outstripped the number of pilots, at least when you take into consideration, aircraft they have in reserve and everything. I mean, the carriers can look short-stocked, but the carriers being short-stocked even in parts of 1942 is more to do with bringing pilots who have met the exceedingly tight qualifications for Japanese Navy carrier pilots online than it is to do with finding aircraft to stick on them. Because then when you look at subsequent battles, both on land airfields and at sea, the Japanese are constantly losing by sort of 43, 44, 200, 300, 400 aircraft in big engagements. But the next engagement, they're still losing 200, 300, 400 aircraft and so on and so forth. So they definitely don't have a shortage of planes to throw at the problem. It's more the fact that training regime is so strict. Actually, in Shattered Sword, it goes into a fair bit of detail on it. If I was going to try and summarize it, though, my feeling is that the training program perhaps got a little bit locked in what I would call an elitism spiral. They wanted to be the absolute best of the best, which is understandable. And so they tried to train everybody to be the absolute best of the best and wouldn't accept you even onto a carrier until you had something like over 500 hours of flight time. It just period you wouldn't be allowed, at least in the pre-war. And so obviously you see this in all sorts of organizations, both going upwards and downwards. But in this case, if you get into a spiral where you are convinced that you must produce the absolute best pilots, you are then going to go, okay, well, how can we, quote unquote, improve our training regimen? We'll make it even harder, because then only the absolute best will get through. And so when you look at the ways that program changed and adapted from its inception in the 20s through to its immediate pre-war state, you suddenly find that, there are pilots who quite happily qualified in the mid-1920s who barely would have been admitted to the first stage of training by, let's say, 1937-38, although by the end of the 1930s they were beginning to make some allowances because of the increased demand for pilots in the Sino-Japanese War, but still. And the Japanese aren't necessarily alone in this. Admiral Fisher pointed out when he became First Sea Lord that according to the Royal Navy's standards circa 1900-1902, Nelson himself would not have been admitted to the Royal Navy Officer Corps training program, which was a bit of a wake-up call. It's just that, to a certain extent, the Japanese got a bit unlucky in that when one of their services ended up going through this upward spiral of elitism, they ended up going to war, and that particular training school ended up being very vital in that war, whereas for most navies, when they've ended up in that kind of spiral, it's either not been something so critical to their war effort, or it's been caught, like with Fisher, before the war broke out. Ian Carr asks, how many of the Royal Navy Light Fleet carriers were commissioned and in the Far East by the end of the war? What were the plans about where and how they would be used, and would they have been in place of or additional to the armoured carriers? Technically speaking, 5 of the carriers were actually in the Far East. You had Colossus, Glory, Venerable and Vengeance, all part of the 11th Aircraft Carrier Squadron along with Illustrious. They were all in the Far East, in Australia actually, just before the atomic bombings. And you also had Pioneer, which was completed as a maintenance carrier in a manner similar to Unicorn. The plans for them were essentially similar to how the US Navy used the Independence class, and they're not necessarily broadly analogous to them, because of course the light fleet carriers were built from the start with the intention of them being aircraft carriers, so perhaps their closest analogues would actually be the Saipans, but essentially their use case was going to be the same. So they would support the armoured carriers, which would continue to be the main fleet carriers, with aircraft, much in the same way as the Independences supported the Essexes and Enterprise in the various US Navy operations. From what plans existed for their deployment, it seems that where the Royal Navy assessed that there was likely to be a significant threat from kamikazes, the armoured carriers would be deployed along that threat vector, with the light fleet carriers a little bit behind. But to a certain extent, this was not necessarily a massive concession, because yes, if you have your blob of aircraft carriers and you think, okay, well, the kamikazes are probably going to come in from the northwest, so you put your armoured flight decks to the northwest, great. Well, if the kamikazes come A, from the direction you thought, and B, come straight at you, then yes, they should in theory smash, if they get through your fighter and anti-aircraft screens, into the more defended armoured carriers. But of course, as we know, the Japanese weren't really that averse to going around and coming in, so there would still be a reasonable chance that they'd be facing incoming kamikazes, albeit a slightly lesser one. But they still very much would have been on the front line. They ironically enough, actually were not viewed as having a particularly long lifespan, in pretty much the same way as the US didn't think the Independences were going to have a particularly long lifespan. But in both cases, the Independence, Saipans, and the light fleet carriers, the Colossus and Majestics, actually ended up lasting extremely long times in some cases. Sam Signorelli asks, certain ships turned out to be the right ship at the right time, the Fletchers being a good example of this. What classes of ship were the right ship in the wrong time, or the wrong ship in the right time? Well, let's, for the sake of ease, characterise the wrong time as, essentially peacetime. So you've made a really brilliant ship, but it serves out its entire life without ever seeing action, which you could argue is actually fairly successful if it's managed to keep the peace by being so scary. But, unlike the Fletchers, didn't really get to show its true capabilities, whereas the wrong ship at the right time would be a ship that potentially could have had uses at other times, but then was put into a war where it really didn't suit. In the latter case, I would probably nominate the Oyodo class cruisers, because in a war in the 1920s or possibly even the 1930s, then, a submarine command cruiser with a bunch of aircraft capability and long-range radios could have been an incredibly useful tool. Aircraft having advanced enough by that point to be considered, properly useful, as opposed to the bulk of the First World War, where they were really, at least in naval terms, a bit fragile. So the Oyodos, would have been a really good ship at that point, but when World War II came about, they were entirely the wrong ship, because technology, radar and submarine technology had just taken leaps and bounds and left them far, far behind. For the right ship in the wrong time, I'm actually going to say Hood is a really good example of that, because Hood has all these potentially wonderful characteristics for a ship. She's fast, she's relatively well protected, she's got decent firepower, she's got size, which lends herself towards being retrofitted, but she comes about at the end of World War I afterwards, so she doesn't get a chance to show off her capabilities when she's brand new. But then by the time of World War II, she's always been just modern enough that other ships have got priority for refits and modernizations. But now it has gotten to the point where she's just old enough that she really desperately needs a full-scale, at least refit, if not modernization, but is thrown into a war, which means she's not going to get it. So, right ship at the wrong time, because refitted or modernized, she could have been an absolute beast even in the Second World War. And another example of that, actually, you could say, was maybe Blücher, the World War I Blücher, because as far as the next stage of armoured cruiser development, and potentially to a certain degree almost linking through to what would eventually become heavy cruisers, she's a really, really good ship for that. But thanks in part to deceptive British intelligence efforts, she's launched into an era of battle cruisers, which is distinctly the wrong time for her kind of ship to be around. Farender Ritter asks, rather long preamble, but in the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode titled Valiant, there is a heavily armed starship, the Valiant, behind enemy lines during a large-scale war. It was meant to be a training cruise for the best officer cadets of the Academy when war broke out. All commissioned officers on the ship were killed, and the remaining officer before passing appointed a cadet as captain, who then decided to wage a guerrilla campaign. This ship rescues two characters of the show, one of whom is a civilian, and one of them was a commissioned ensign. That, of course, was Ensign Nog. He did not take command, rather he followed the cadet captain that eventually led to all the cadets bar one being killed. The writer of that episode claimed to use a Victorian-era tradition of not taking command of a ship with an officer not part of the ship's crew unless a higher authority approves. Was this a thing? If a ship did lose all the officers, couldn't an ensign be sent over to take command? And what did navies actually do to restore officer command due to battle losses? If there was an officer who refused to take command when no others were available, isn't that a court-martial offence? Yeah, that was an interesting episode of Deep Space Nine, actually. Now, in terms of the Victorian era tradition of not taking command of a ship with an officer from another part of the ship's crew unless a higher authority approves, technically speaking, that is correct, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. Firstly, it's to do with the fact that, especially in the Age of Sail, and to a certain extent even afterwards and nowadays, a officer, a captain in particular, is commissioned to command a particular vessel. It's a little bit looser these days, not that much though, but especially back in those days, if you had, as you can see here, HMS Valiant, if HMS Valiant was commissioned for a voyage, then a particular officer would be commissioned to command that ship until such time as he is relieved. If for whatever reason they pick up another captain, let's say as a passenger or from another ship that sunk or whatever, even if he has the seniority, he has not been commissioned by the Navy to command this particular ship. And also, on a more practical level, he doesn't know the ship, he doesn't know the crew, he doesn't know how it all works. He's going to be starting, if he did take command, from a much, much weaker position. So the general principle of you don't mess with whoever's in command unless something really exceptional happens generally holds. And the same thing, when you have senior officers being transported as passengers, they don't just randomly go up to the deck one day and go, you know what, I don't think you're doing a particularly good job, I'm taking command now, because they don't technically have that authority unless you're talking about really, really high ranking officers. And even if they could make it arguable, again, they really would almost certainly be doing a worse job. Now, when you're talking about battle losses, if a ship did somehow manage to lose all its officers, could you send over an officer, a commissioned officer of some kind from another ship to take command? Yes, you could. That definitely would be a thing. However, it would be exceptionally rare because, to be perfectly honest, if you're in a circumstance where every single commissioned officer has been killed, there are very few circumstances where that could happen and the ship is still afloat and able to be commanded for any particular length of time. And if somehow magically that did happen, there are a series of experienced NCOs like the ship's master and so forth who can guide the ship until such time as everything calms down and they can arrange for a new command crew to come across. Albeit that if you were going to do that, you would probably want, at least in the Age of Sail, at least a senior lieutenant or something like that. When it comes to battle losses in the Age of Sail, generally speaking, if the battle losses weren't too severe, people just got moved up the food chain. So if your first and third lieutenants were killed, then the second lieutenant becomes the first lieutenant. If you have a fourth lieutenant, he becomes the second lieutenant, and any remaining spaces would either be filled directly or at least on an intermediary basis from the midshipmen. And, if the captain's killed, then the first lieutenant will take over, and so on and so forth. You only really have to supplement that officer cadre if you've taken devastating losses, and perhaps that includes the captain, the first and the second lieutenants. Now, the third lieutenant, if you had one, would still theoretically have the experience to at least get the ship to safety, but outside of unusual circumstances like being isolated, you would ideally want to get a more experienced officer aboard there fairly quickly. But it also depends on what you constitute as a higher authority. The admiral of a fleet can authorize transfers of command, obviously. So you could have all this situation occur, and the admiral of the fleet that ship is part of can get it all sorted. You don't necessarily have to write all the way home to, Navy HQ, wherever that happens to be. Now, if there is an officer who refuses to take command when no others are available, it depends on the Navy whether that's a court-martial offence, and also the circumstances. If you're talking about in the middle of a battle, a ship blows up, another ship wanders over and rescues you, and it turns out that we've got one of these magical circumstances where perhaps all, or at least all of the senior officers, if not necessarily all the officers, have been killed. So let's say it's a commander who's been plucked out the water and only like the ship's 4th lieutenant is left in command. In the midst of battle, assuming that nothing is going dramatically immediately wrong, you still wouldn't necessarily take command unless it was by invitation, because you'd be disrupting the flow of the ship. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle, assuming you weren't asked to in the middle, then the gap in seniority would be enough that you probably would be expected to take command of the ship, at least notionally, to get it home. If, however, you're the senior most surviving officer already on the ship and everybody above you dies and you refuse to take command, yeah, you're probably getting court-martialed for that, unless there's massive extenuating circumstances. But you've also got, in this particular case, the practicalities of the issue. Firstly, of course, in the case of the USS Valiant, if Nog had tried to assert command, there is an almost zero chance the Red Squad cadets would have listened to him. And secondly, you've also got to take into account practical experience. Nog was a freshly minted ensign, mostly with engineering experience, not particularly sure of himself, whereas the Red Squad cadet captain was presumably had already been on the command track and therefore probably actually had more command training than Nog at that point. And he was already in command and, taking on the whatever his, as it turned out, self-appointed mission was. The experience gap between the two would have been so small that the theoretical fact that Nog outranked him also would have made it relatively impractical for him to take command, even if the rest of Red Squad had wanted him to or were prepared to accept it. Whereas somebody more senior, such as, if it had been TNG's Commander Riker or Sisko himself, Commander later Captain Sisko, or even someone like Dax or Worf, they would have had enough experience, as well as being a commissioned officer, that they could have turned around and gone, no, actually, you know what, at this point I am taking command and you're going to listen to me. John McDonough asks, I recently visited a small maritime museum near where I live in the small town of Essex, Connecticut. I was amazed to see a statement posted about shipbuilding in the town that estimated that during the Age of Sail, from approximately 1640 to 1900, this area manufactured approximately 4,000 ocean-going sailing vessels for the Caribbean, South American, and transatlantic trade. This got me thinking that if a small, nondescript little river town could produce so much, how much did Portsmouth, Lisbon, Rotterdam, etc., produce? Has there ever been an estimate of how many ocean-going commercial vessels a given port or region produced? And am I right in thinking that there were hundreds of thousands of sailing vessels on the world's ocean in any given year during the latter part of the Age of Sail? The problem with making those kinds of estimates over that kind of time period is, one, how many records have survived, but also how exactly do you classify ocean going? Because these days, ocean going has slightly stricter requirements than back then. I mean, back then you could have a little schooner like HMS Pickle maybe that displaces not even 100 tons, but would be classified as a completely ocean-going vessel. And perhaps even fishing vessels and obviously mercantile vessels that might be even smaller than that, again, theoretically capable of making oceanic voyages, and therefore would be classified as an ocean-going sailing vessel. Obviously, the opposite end of that would be a massive East Indiaman or something like this. So when you compare that to somewhere like Portsmouth, which is primarily a navy yard, or somewhere big like Lisbon or Rotterdam, you do have to take this into account, because you can have an area that's producing loads and loads and loads and loads of really small craft, I say, double-digit, low three-digit tons, which numerically could outproduce somewhere like Portsmouth, but somewhere like Portsmouth could turn out a first rate, which requires orders of magnitude more resources and time to produce than a ton of small craft. In a similar way, you could look at one set of shipyards in either the US or the UK in World War II and go, oh, well, this shipyard produced so many dozen corvettes or so many dozen destroyer escorts, or something like the Kaiser shipyards. You could say they built 50 Casablanca class escort carriers, and compared to this other Navy yard or Royal Dockyard in the UK, well, they only produced 2 or 3 carriers or a battleship or 2 in the same time period. But again, what's the difference in resources and completion time between a 45,000 ton battleship or aircraft carrier versus a 800, 900 ton escort or smaller? And the other problem, of course, is that in a really big area like Portsmouth, Lisbon, Rotterdam, etc., you will have multiple shipyards coming and going under different names, different companies, different sizes. So you'd have to try and collate all of that together. I suspect somewhere that was a more mercantile area like Lisbon or Rotterdam would probably have colossal ship production figures, whereas somewhere like Portsmouth or Chatham, which mainly is producing larger warships, would perhaps have smaller numerical production figures, but perhaps by total tonnage launched might actually still be ahead. As for total numbers of sailing vessels, I think in the latter part of the Age of Sail, hundreds of thousands of ships. I would say comfortably yes if you included coastal craft. For ocean-going craft, I think 6-figure numbers probably might be pushing it, maybe not. I mean, when you look at some of the records, you can kind of see the growth of tonnage of ocean-going vessels, because in, say, 1810, there's just over 20,000 vessels registered in the British merchant fleet, with a total registered tonnage of about 2.2 million tons. By 1900, 1910, there's about the same number of vessels on the register, but the registered tonnage has grown to around about 10 million tons. So, 5 times increase in registered tonnage, even though the number of actual vessels hasn't changed all that much. But another way of looking at it would be if you look at the port records for the Port of London. So in the early 1800s, so 1820, 1830, that kind of period, you're looking at 5,000 to 10,000 ships per year, i.e. that is ocean-going ships, entering the Port of London, but about 20,000 coastal ships entering and leaving the Port of London. Now, of course, London is only one port, but it is a fairly major one. And of course, a lot of the ships that enter and leave the Port of London in any given year, well, obviously they're going other places. So if you look at Rotterdam, Cherbourg, Brest, Bordeaux, Hamburg, etc., you might have similar numbers in some of those ports, but a lot of them are going to be the same ships bouncing around. Now, obviously, the further afield you go, the less likely it is that ships are going to show up multiple times in the same place, but still, you might be pushing towards 100,000 ocean-going vessels of all sizes, and bear in mind that can even be double-digit tonnage in the late Age of Sail, but if you include coastal vessels, then it's easily going to blow past that by quite a margin. Brandon Minders asks, did the Spanish Armada respond to the English style of race-built galleons and construct their own race-built galleons, or did they just stick to their traditional ships? And how effective were whichever countermeasures they adopted? The Spanish had a number of responses, one of which was to build even bigger, stronger galleons, because race-built galleons were still at a fundamental disadvantage at close range, and if you could make a galleon big enough and mean enough that, even relatively speaking, slow and ponderous as it was, its firepower could hold off an English galleon, and in boarding it would decisively be the winner. That was one option. Another option was they did in fact build a slimmed down version of the galleon, which you could describe as their own version of a race-built galleon, called a Galizabra, I think that's how it's pronounced. But by the time any significant level of dedicated countermeasure had come about, the race-built galleon itself had been superseded. Because you've got to remember, race-built galleons are near enough a innovation of the late 1500s. So they have a period of being the most advanced warship designs, that is, on the seas for maybe 2-3 decades, which, especially in those times, is not a huge amount of time to turn around your own design principles and then start building in any significant numbers any kind of specific counter. And then by the time you get into the early 1600s, there's a whole raft of designs which are taking themes in some ways from the race-built galleon, but by the 1620s, 1630s, you're beginning to see the rise of the frigate. And I suppose in some ways you could say that the race-built galleon is a superior fighting platform in most circumstances to the regular galleon, hence flutes and Dunkirkers and Galizabras and so on and so forth. But then what it embodies kind of splits away again. So the general design grows again, but into a somewhat swifter vessel with considerably more emphasis on firepower, and that goes on to become the great ship, which culminates with things like Sovereign of the Seas, which we would call a ship of the line later on. And then the other idea of particularly swift and nimble vessels, but with lesser armament than the great ships, becomes essentially the frigate. So, yes, the Spanish did to a certain extent build counters to the race-built galleon, but realistically ship design evolved past the race-built galleon before any real significant dedicated countermeasures could come into play. Elliot W. James asks, during the Russo-Japanese War, relations between the Japanese Navy and Army were cordial and cooperative. What went wrong over the next 30 years? Well, there was always some friction, even in the Russo-Japanese War. However, if there were two main reasons why their relationship deteriorated so badly, firstly, it would be the rise of extremism in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, because in that kind of environment, the most extreme flourish, and the most extreme in their rivalry also therefore flourish. But another element of that, which is separate but related, is that while the Japanese Navy and Army did have a fairly powerful voice in the pre-World War I Japanese political scene, by the time you get to the 20s, 30s, and then World War II, the Japanese military as a whole is now an integral part of the higher echelons of politics rather than subordinate to them, which means there's a whole aspect of political power and career, as in directly running of government, involved. And once politics gets involved as well, the Army and the Navy have increasingly diverging ideas on what should be the destiny of Japan. Now, in the early part of the modern Japanese period, you've basically got to deal with the potential threat of Russia, which is obviously dealt with in the Russo-Japanese War, the more immediate potential threat of China, which had been dealt with previously in the Sino-Japanese War, and general expansion near the Japanese home islands, which they'd also pulled off in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But once that immediate issue had been dealt with, the Japanese army, broadly speaking, saw Japan's destiny as a great land power on the continent of Asia, because of course they would, because they're an army, hence why you end up with a massive war in China in the 1930s, and to be honest, in the 40s as well. Whereas the Navy saw Japan's destiny, shockingly, at sea as a great overseas colonial power, occupying lots of islands and other things, much in the manner of the British Empire. And if you look at a map of Japan versus the islands of the Pacific and the main part of, sort of China and the bulk of continental Asia, they're not only politically, but also geographically almost exactly in opposite directions. And obviously all of this exacerbates the tension, because if you have two completely diametrically opposed views for the future of the country, and you now have the capability of gaining political charge of the country to implement one of your visions, well, there's only going to be one person standing at the end of it. Library of Context asks, contract warship building, i.e. building new warships for foreign nations, did this start with steam-powered ironclads, or did it happen in earlier periods that the channel covers? And were there any unexpected contracted warship-building nations? It definitely predates the steam-powered ironclad period, because there were private shipbuilders long before then, and as long as there's a private shipbuilder, they will take money from almost anyone. Usually they won't take money from someone that the nation is directly at war with at the time, or has very recently been at war with, although there are a few exceptions even to that rule. But yes, there are foreign-built warships in lots of different navies at various different points. Now, some are built for a specific navy and then bought by someone else overseas. Bearing in mind, obviously, this is going back not just into the period where navies are very much state arms, but even to the period when navies are the personal playthings of monarchs. So you have things like the Jesus of Lubeck, which was built for the city of Lubeck, but then was bought by Henry VIII. So don't think that necessarily counts as a private contract directly, because when the contract for the ship's construction was placed, it wasn't for a foreign power. However, you do have to take into account two things. One is that in the majority of the age of sail, almost any nation could build almost any ship if they absolutely had to, and they could scrape up the money. You know, the Scottish, which were comparatively a fairly small people, not in height, but number of people, in the Tudor period, managed to build the Great Michael, which was by far and away the largest ship in Northern European waters at the time of her construction, by most accounts, until Henry Grâce-à-Dieu was built in response by the English. And, you know, yes, she was a one-off, extremely expensive, not particularly heavily used flagship for mostly showing off, but she could be built. Now, once you get into perhaps the 18th century, you start to get to a period where the really big first rates probably can't be built by some of the smaller powers, but they can't afford them anyway, so they wouldn't order them. But anything smaller than that, you know, you could just build it, because wooden warships of that period are large, but they're not that large. A lot of the big issues with building progressively large ironclads and dreadnoughts you have in the 19th and 20th centuries don't really arise too much back in those days. So if you're going to see foreign contracted warships coming about, it's going to be in one of two guises. Either just straight up ordering because it'll be faster, which is more a matter of convenience and therefore will happen fairly irregularly, or the other thing, which is, I'll grant you, a little bit more arguable as to whether it's foreign-built warship contracts, is that back in the older days of the Age of Sail, the shipwrights were the key thing, not the shipyards, because, as I said, you could build a shipyard to build almost anything of any size to a certain degree in the Age of Sail if you really wanted to. And so, rather than necessarily saying, okay, foreign power A, I want you to build warship B, and I'm going to send you a bunch of money to do it, quite often you would have a nation that wanted to build a warship, and they would then contract a foreign shipwright and shipbuilder, but they would then come over to that country and supervise the work, and if necessary even set up the shipyard. So actually, looking back at the Great Michael, for instance, the Scottish king ordered in some European shipwrights to actually oversee and design the ship in the first place. And they were, of course, under contract to him, so even though the ship was physically built in Scotland by Scottish labour and with Scottish timber, her design and the overseeing of her construction was done by foreign shipwrights. So that, I would argue, that is technically a form of contract construction. Nick Brodar asks, what are cruiser submarines and how are they different from the World War II fleet boats? There are two stages of cruiser submarine, and each differs from the World War II fleet boats in slightly different ways. The second generation of cruiser submarine is perhaps the most obvious. So you've got subs like X1 and Surcouf, which are, well, almost literally cruisers that happen to be submarines. So they have really large caliber gun turrets on top, and they rely mostly on their guns, ostensibly by roll, as opposed to torpedoes, to carry out their mission. Whereas obviously the World War II fleet boats primarily are supposed to be using their torpedoes. They do have a deck gun or two, but they're mostly for self-defense or for use against lesser targets, not their primary armament. So that's a fairly easy distinction. However, these cruiser subs, X1, Surcouf and the like, they are, as I say, the kind of the second generation of the cruiser sub, because there was an earlier iteration of cruiser submarine idea from which these developed, and that didn't have heavy guns as its primary armament, although some of the early concepts did, but the ones that at least got executed or got close to in the 1910s were looking at cruiser sub not from the position of a cruiser grade armament, but from a position of cruiser type range. Because remember, in World War I, almost all submarines were fairly short range. Yes, they could operate in the Atlantic, but if you look at where most Allied ships were lost to German U-boats in World War I, you'll notice it's pretty much the western approaches and this very eastern side of the Atlantic. There are a few losses further out, but not as many. Whereas if you look at U-boat losses in World War II, when the subs are somewhat longer range, you'll see they're much, much more spread out. And this limited range in World War I subs meant that the initial concept of a cruiser submarine essentially just meant a submarine that can go a really long way and hopefully stay out on station for quite some time after it had gone out a really long way. That, of course, necessitated a large submarine and a fairly efficient one for sailing on the surface, because that's what it was going to be doing most of the time, which sounds like a lot like a US fleet boat or other similar craft. However, one of the critical differences between a fleet boat concept and a cruiser submarine, while they both have to have long range and a decent number of torpedoes, is that a cruiser submarine was not strictly required to have any particular top speed. If you could go out into the middle of the Atlantic or to the southern Atlantic or whatever and stay there for weeks at a time, and your maximum speed was 16, 17, 18 knots, nobody particularly cared. Higher speed would be nice because it would accelerate your ability to get there, but it wasn't an absolute aim. If going at 20 knots meant that you would only go 2/3 the distance, then they'd rather you went to, let's say, 17 and actually got there. Whereas with a fleet sub, surface speed sufficient to keep up with the fleet is an absolute must, hence why you get attempts early on with things like the K-class, and they're absolutely pulling their hair out trying to get the things to go fast enough, hence the adoption of steam power plants. Some of the early, what would later be called V-boats in the US, had a similar role, and the Gatos, Balaus, Tenches, etc., well, and their predecessors like the Sargos and so forth, they all derive from the same concept originally of keeping up with a battle fleet, hence a 21 knot top speed, because that's what the top battle line speed of the US fleet was before the introduction of the fast battleships. The slightly funny thing, of course, is that the first ideas on a cruiser submarine fed into quite heavily the first attempts on fleet boats, and of course that didn't really work out, although some other larger long-range derivatives from the initial cruiser ideas did. And of course the big gun cruiser submarines got killed by treaties. The World War II fleet boats actually didn't work as fleet boats. They were never used in support of the US battle fleet, partially because it was not particularly brilliant idea to start with, although it sounded really good, which is why everyone chased it. But also, of course, because the introduction of fast battleships and carriers meant that even a 21 knot top speed meant you were pretty much never going to keep up. But they actually excelled in doing what the original mission of the original cruiser sub was supposed to be, which was long-distance anti-commerce warfare. So if you look at it kind of sideways and through a twisted mirror, you could classify the World War II fleet boats, at least the US ones, as the most successful failures of the war, because they utterly failed in their role as fleet support units, but they worked brilliantly as long-distance raiders. Greg M. asks, is it correct as a general statement that the US Navy usually concentrated its forces while the Japanese Navy often either held back assets that could have contributed to further shrinking the US Navy early in the war, or divided its forces in complex battle plans? One explanation for the Japanese behaviour in holding back forces was to conserve forces for a decisive battle. Are there any other explanations for the Japanese Navy in effect allowing itself to be defeated in detail, both by using less than maximum force available and or dividing the forces it committed? I wouldn't say that that's correct as a general statement. In fact, I would actually say that in the early part of the war, the very early part of the war, it's actually the other way round, but that the two lines cross over very quickly and flip. Because if you look at the very early part of the war, with, say, Pearl Harbor, or even Operation C to a certain extent, and, Shikaku, Zuikaku side, collectively, at least to a certain degree, the Midway operation, although that's perhaps on a slightly shakier foundation, and certainly some of the battles of the ABDA campaign. In the very early part of the war, from December 7th, 1941 to maybe April, May 42, the Japanese Navy is, by and large, actually committing fairly substantial forces to various battles, Pearl Harbor being the obvious one. But even when you look at their advance south with their fights with ABDA Command, usually the Japanese outnumber and outgun the Allied forces they're meeting. So they're not committing penny packet forces that are kind of just about equal. If you look at, say, the Battle of Java Sea, if you took any two navies and substituted them in for the Japanese and ABDA Command, you would expect the side that's taking the place of the Japanese to win, assuming that you have committed similar gauges of forces. So it would be, Admiral Hipper class, heavy cruisers if it was the Kriegsmarine, Zaras if it was the Italians, and so on and so forth. Whereas the US Navy early on, partially because of Pearl Harbor and partially because of early losses and partially because of tactics and doctrine of the time, is actually the one that's committing relative penny packets of forces. Partly, as I say, because they're trying to stamp out a million brush fires at once, partly because of the losses they've taken in the far western Pacific in the very early stages of the war, plus Pearl Harbor, and so on and so forth. And then, as we saw in the second of the Admiral Spruance videos, as the US industrial capacity was building up in late 42 and into 43, some US Navy officers wanted to continue to do this. I mean, you can even look at the Guadalcanal campaign, how the US kind of fed its cruisers and destroyers in relatively speaking small numbers and got them chewed up. And then you have Spruance and Nimitz sitting back at Pearl Harbor telling them, no, this is dumb, we're not doing this anymore, stop asking us to. Now we are going to concentrate our forces into much, much bigger elements. And so mid to late 43 onwards, that's when you start to see the US Navy show up en masse, which, then from that point onwards to the end of the war, then your statement would be correct. The Japanese, on the other hand, having started out the war hitting with pretty heavy elements of their fleet, as you said, then when you get to kind of mid-42 and then early 43 onwards, they are the ones who are now holding back forces, partially from fuel concerns, partially because they haven't quite necessarily appreciated the full scope of some of the campaigns that they're fighting, and partially, obviously, as you said, to conserve forces for the final battle, or the decisive battle, which, as far as the Japanese are concerned, never comes, but probably actually hits them over the head a couple of times during the war without them initially realizing that that's what's going on. And partly, one can be blamed for the other, because initially, without the US committing the full strength of its fleet, or at least what the Japanese think is the full strength of their fleet, then the Japanese aren't going to commit the full strength of their fleet, because, well, if the US isn't committing all their strength, then this clearly isn't the decisive battle. And if we commit all of our strength, this being from the Japanese perspective, then we might take losses that will weaken us too much for the decisive battle, which is exactly obviously what they wanted to do to the Americans, except that in so doing, they end up losing a bunch of forces anyway, as do the Americans, but the Americans have the greater industrial might. So then, as we said, come mid to late 43, once the US starts showing up in large numbers, now suddenly it's shifted from we want to hold our ships back for the decisive battle to we don't actually necessarily have the ships to match this force. Therefore, it's not a good idea to throw them all away pointlessly. But perhaps with all our other ships that we're building that will come online, we might then be able to later confront them in a decisive battle. So we will only confront them partially at the moment and essentially try and whittle them down or slow down their fleet increases so that we can hit them later on. So, yeah, to a certain degree, both sides' doctrines worked against each other, but not necessarily in ways they'd actually anticipated, but which eventually played into the strengths of the US's massive industry. HMS Etc. asks, why did the Kriegsmarine in 1941 not wait until Bismarck was ready before planning the sortie of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau? Various reasons. Some of it was competition with the Army and the Luftwaffe, because of course the Army and the Luftwaffe had delivered Hitler most of continental Europe, and even at the beginning of 1941, of course, there were beginnings of preparations to go after Russia, which played more so into the voyage of Bismarck than it did Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but it was still a factor. So if you've got big, expensive assets and you're the Kriegsmarine, you need to be seen to be using them. Otherwise, given that the German Army and the Luftwaffe are in constant operation, first, obviously, in Eastern Europe, then in Norway, then in France, then in North Africa, and obviously then upcoming in Russia, it's going to be difficult to justify your funding if the other two armed services branches are constantly doing stuff and you're sitting there with your biggest capital assets going, well, I think I want to wait another third of a year before I do anything with them. Another element was that just outside of competition, if you have a big expensive asset, you need to use it, especially if you only have a few assets. You need to make maximum possible use of them. The Scharnhorsts had already been out on one merchant raiding operation. Then they headed off to take part in the Norwegian campaign. Both had ended up being torpedoed in the Norwegian campaign and then obviously subsequently needed repairs. Operation Berlin, when they're sent out at the beginning of 41, is pretty much great. We've got them out of repairs, both of them. We can actually make use of them again, so back on the front line as quickly as possible. The other issue was that while obviously U-boats and German surface ships had been attacking British and Allied merchant vessels since the start of the war, in the late summer of 1940, Hitler had ordered that the Kriegsmarine should redouble its efforts against British ships. And at the time, obviously, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were in need of repairs, but once they had been repaired, given that they had this standing order to make more use of their assets, they couldn't just sit there and go, yes, Herr Führer, however, I know you want us to go and use these assets, but, we're going to just sit on them for a bit until another even bigger, more expensive asset comes along. That wouldn't have ended well. So out they went. So a combination of all of those factors, plus opportunity as well, because the relative strengths of the home fleet and the cover of weather to allow you to actually make the breakout attempt come and go. And, well, when they launched Operation Berlin, the first time it didn't actually work, ironically enough, because the weather was too bad. I mean, it was providing them excellent cover, but it also bashed up Gneisenau enough she needed repairs. and then the second time it worked. Glenn Ricafrente asks, in recent Drydocks you mentioned there were Japanese incursions into the Indian Ocean aside from Operation C, including a couple of big cruiser raids. Could you talk a little bit more about these? The two biggest operations outside of the Indian Ocean raid, Operation C, one of which actually slightly predates Operation C at the beginning of 1942, the operation of the Andaman Islands on the eastern side of the Indian Ocean. That actually involved a force that numerically was larger than that involved in Operation C, and the primary strength of which was Rougeau plus 4 big heavy cruisers. But of course, they didn't have any battleships or fleet carriers with them, so in terms of striking power, it was slightly smaller. But that was a fairly major incursion, something that the Allies actually looked at and said, we do not have the strength in the area to oppose this, which was unfortunate for the poor old Andaman Islanders because, well, the Japanese were about as charming and, as Japanese troops of the Second World War are reputed to have been. The other major operation was actually sometimes dubbed the Indian Ocean Raid 2, or Indian Ocean Raid of 1944, and that involved the heavy cruisers Alba, Tone, and Chikuma, so the 2 sister ships plus Alba, and they went out on a twofold mission. Partly it was commerce raiding, but partly the other objective was not just the traditional sink enemy commerce, it was actually capture enemy commerce, because Japan by 1944 was actually remarkably low on merchant shipping, courtesy of the US submarine fleet, amongst other things. And so they thought, well, if we're going out and we're finding enemy merchant ships anyway, we might as well take them back for ourselves. So those ships actually were somewhat overmanned with boarding parties for this idea. And rather like the troops stationed on the Andaman Islands, they were not in the mood for playing around. The orders were to kill basically everybody except those who might have valuable intelligence on the ships that they found, rather unlike pretty much every other commerce raiding mission, where either you ensure the safety of the people on the ships that you are about to sink, or at the very least, even unrestricted U-boat warfare usually doesn't involve the active butchering of all the survivors. The whole thing was, in a way, actually an unintended side effect of Operation Hailstone, because that's the big raid on truck, by the way, because the approach of US forces had forced the Japanese to move what was left of the combined fleet west, a good chunk of it to Singapore, which now meant there were a bunch of Japanese cruisers and capital ships in Singapore, and the Japanese fleet essentially looked at what would happen to truck and went, okay, maybe we don't want to fight those guys just yet, but in the interim, while we're over in this part of the world, we might as well go poking around the Indian Ocean. And the irony was, actually, in that particular operation, both sides were incredibly twitchy. The Eastern Fleet, the British force in the Indian Ocean, was at the time temporarily quite low on strength, and obviously they didn't know exactly how strong the Japanese force coming in was going to be. So Somerville was quite nervous of what the Japanese might send in, and the Japanese were equally nervous, at this point obviously being 44, that the Allies might have extremely heavy forces present in the region, which is partly why the raid didn't really amount to much, because the British ordered merchant ships on diversions, which meant it was difficult for the Japanese to find anybody. They only found a single merchant ship. It ran whilst transmitting a distress signal. They sank it, took the survivors aboard, headed off, and then decided, it sent off a distress signal, there's probably a massive Allied fleet coming for us, we better head away and go back home. And it was on the return voyage that the Japanese admiral insisted on killing pretty much everybody who was left of the survivors still aboard at that point. Grumman Cat asks, I've sometimes read about ocean liners which were not old by any means, being described as worn out and probably worth scrapping after service in World War II. The Ile-de-France of 1927 is a good example of this. In her case, the desperate demand for tonnage following the war reprieved her. But I'm curious, can you elaborate on the kind of wear and tear that a civil ship might go through that could put, as one Queen Elizabeth author described, about 20 years' worth of fatigue on the ship? Part of it was the ships were largely gutted for their use as troop ships, because of course you didn't need massive fancy decorations and so forth if you're just going to pack in as many troops as you could possibly get into these liners, because they were primarily used as transport and troop vessels. And of course that meant that when you got them back, you had to put everything back, assuming it had been kept, or replace it if it hadn't been kept or it had been damaged in the interim. And that was going to cost money. Even if you could extract some costs out of the government that had commandeered the ship, it was still going to take time and money, which may or may not be worth it, but obviously is a bit of a stress. Another element of it was that in between the decision of war breaking out and the decision of using the ships as troop ships, there was, for a number of them, an indeterminate amount of time where obviously there wasn't a transatlantic passenger service, so they were just laid up without maintenance, which of course increases wear and tear quite quickly, as opposed to when they're in civilian service where they're always under care. Then you have the fact that, as well as transporting troops, they were often used to transport significant cargoes, and where the cargo couldn't be fitted into the holds, it was often just stacked up on the decks, the open decks that could be accessed, which of course they weren't designed to have done to them, which increased wear and tear on the structure. And then you have two other factors, one of which is that in the course of a normal voyage, if a large ocean liner at the time had any issue, an engine breakdown, it hit something, anything like that, you would slow down to conserve the ship and then have it checked out when you got into dock. In World War II, the risk from U-boats was so high, given that these things usually travelled unescorted, that it really didn't matter what went wrong with you. As long as you could maintain full power or something close to it, you were maintaining full power and thus full speed, which of course would exacerbate any damage. The damage would be patched up once you reached dock, but internal stresses that might have inflicted would have been considerably more. And related to that, obviously in times of peace, the ship would, or whichever ship you're looking at, would be used quite often to generate revenue for the company, because much like airliners these days, a ship that's sitting idle is a ship that's not earning its company any money. But of course there were peak seasons and off seasons, and in between each voyage you'd give the ship a once over, some maintenance, and once the main cruising season was done, the ship could have a nice refit and a bit of upkeep before it went back out again on reduced voyages until the season picked up again. Whereas in the Second World War, demand for the use of the ships was such that you just kept going and going and going and going and going and going and going. And there wasn't really an off season for them. So a lot of them were just driven for 3, 4, 5 years, near enough constantly. And that also puts a huge amount of wear. Not necessarily in and of itself 20 years of wear, but all of these factors combined, especially the fact that a lot of minor bits and pieces that would otherwise be treated or mitigated wouldn't be, meant that collectively you end up putting a lot of mileage on the ships. Much the same way actually as you see on warships, because a warship of the period could be expected to have a certain lifespan, usually about 20 years before it needed its machinery replaced. But you see some ships that were either launched in the early years of the war or just before the war. By the end of the war, their machinery's pretty much shot. And it's one of the reasons why a good number of immediately pre-war and immediate into war launched vessels either go into reserves very soon after the war, or else they're kept on as kind of placeholders for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they go into the reserves, and in both cases very often they never come out again, because once they've gone into the reserves, to bring them out of the reserves and give them another 4, 5, 10 years at sea, you're going to have to go through a very expensive machinery refit, even though they've only actually been active for 4 to 5 years of war and maybe 3 or 4 years of peace. Primark359 asks, a few months ago I asked about jet torpedo bombers. Since then my news algorithm has provided me with many articles on QUICKSINK JDAMs being tested on this or that airframe. My question is QUICKSINK an aerial torpedo? And if so, are diving shells torpedoes? is the B-2 now a torpedo bomber? Or am I correct in my suspicion that the definition of a torpedo requires some form of underwater propulsion? So although largely a modern era question, the reason I'm answering it is because the answer lies back in the time period the channel covers. And you are correct. The technical definition of a torpedo, as we use it today, and as we pretty much have used it throughout the 20th century as well, requires a form of underwater propulsion. Because if you remember way back in the mid-19th century, torpedo just meant some form of underwater explosive. Hence why Admiral Farragut said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. The Confederates weren't firing what we would consider torpedoes at him. They had a big minefield, and that's what he was referring to. And then as you get the development of the Whitehead torpedo and various other competing designs, you get the split in definition between torpedo, what we would today call a mine, and the self-propelled or locomotive torpedo, which eventually drops the appellation and just becomes torpedo because the stationary version becomes mine, so you have torpedoes and mines. Therefore, since we haven't really changed the definition of torpedo since then, a torpedo is an underwater explosives delivery system that contains its own propulsion. And while this new, well, not new weapon, this adaptation of an existing weapon has a torpedo-like effect in that it is detonating a large amount of explosive under the keel of a target vessel, it is only a torpedo-like effect. It in and of itself is no more a torpedo than the B-bomb of World War II was a torpedo. It's just a bomb that happens to explode near, or in this case under the ship, as opposed to on or in the ship. Texas and La Choc asks, recently I saw a video doing a breakdown of USS Arizona, and it showed the officers' quarters, including the captain's and admiral's quarters, as being in the aft section, almost directly above the propellers, which seemed a bit odd. Why were they located there? So this goes all the way back to the Age of Sail, because if you've ever been on an Age of Sail, either original ship like Constitution or Victory or Constellation, or a replica like Golden Hind, or the Spanish galleon replica, etc., or even Gothenburg in Sweden, then you'll notice that, well, you probably don't want to be in the bow. It gets very damp, and it's the bit that does the most pitching and the slamming. The midships portion of the ship is mostly gun deck and cargo holds, and where the riffraff, aka the regular crew, sleep. Whereas the stern is probably the gentlest area. It's the most well lit and most well ventilated because you've got all that glass in the aft section. And it's still fairly wide. It's not quite as wide as the midships, but it's certainly still got quite a bit of width to it. And therefore, it kind of became the officers' area to live. There was also, at that time, in the Age of Sail, a more practical element of where was an officer's position of command. Well, it was either going to be on the poop deck or near the ship's wheel, and where were they? They were right aft. So if something went horribly wrong, you could tumble out of your cot or your bunk or your bed or whatever it is you were sleeping in and take about 6 steps and you were at your duty station. This, roughly speaking, continued just as a matter of tradition through the ironclad era, although, as you point out, it became a somewhat less desirable situation to be in because instead of being in the nice quiet part of the ship, you are now right over the propellers and the propeller shaft, which is decidedly not quite so quiet. And indeed, if you go and have a look at HMS Gannet in Chatham Dockyard, the officers also had to put up with the raising shaft of the retractable propeller being in the middle of their area. However, there wasn't really a huge amount of choice in the early iron to mid-ironclad period, because where was your duty station now? Well, the bridge, as it gradually became to be, was obviously both gradually forming and gradually moving further forward. However, broadside ironclads still had a big gun deck, so you didn't want to stick the officers in the middle of that. Central battery ironclads, well, they had a central battery, which was pretty much where you would otherwise have wanted to put the officers' quarters, so you couldn't do that. And early turreted ironclads, the turrets were very much amidships, so again, turret machinery, etc., took up space there. And it's only when you start to get ironclads with a more or less pre-Dreadnought style layout, or at least they're putting the turrets to either end, obviously starting off with Devastation and Thunder, but then there's a whole run of central battery ships. But essentially, once the armament starts to move more towards the ends, the superstructure can start to grow quite significantly, and then there is the possibility of relocating the officers. However, early superstructures are still not particularly large, and by the time you get to the pre-dreadnoughts and the dreadnoughts, you now have casemate batteries and very large funnel trunks and so forth running along amidships, so still not a particularly brilliant place to put officers. And it's only really when you get to the late 1900s, early 1910s, as superstructures start to get somewhat more built up, that there's a concerted movement to start to relocate officers' quarters to just forward of amidships in the superstructure, or somewhere relatively close to that, because then you're now moving the officers much closer to their action stations and away from the extremely noisy propellers and so forth. But you still have to contest with, the main battery locations, the barbettes, the other quarters and facilities you need to provide, the funnels, the mast base, and the secondary battery, which is occupying in a lot of ships the first deck below the upper deck. And the superstructures still aren't very large, so look at any picture of USS Arizona shortly after her launch. There's a particularly famous one of her in the East River in New York City, and you'll see that compared to a fast battleship, her superstructure still really isn't that large. The conning tower makes up the largest part of it. There's not a huge amount of space in there. And unlike some ships of the period, which have mounted their secondary batteries in the superstructure, her secondary battery still very much is a casement battery on that first deck below the upper deck, at which point keeping the officers in the relatively speaking less useful right aft position on the second deck and slightly below above the steering gear is just the best way to approach things. Now, as I said, in this time period, ships are beginning to experiment with moving officers' quarters forward, but it's not a done thing. It does switch back and forth a fair bit. But that's why it's like that still on Arizona. In later ships, eventually, as they get larger and as there's more superstructure volume, etc., then the officers' quarters do start to shift further forward, which is a more sensible thing for where their action stations are. Jeffrey Conley asks, in World of Warships, the Japanese Tier 4 battleship-battle cruiser is supposedly based off the 12-inch designs of the Kongo class before Vicker's famous 14-inch gun salesman got involved. My question is, if the Kongo class were armed with 12-inch guns like this, would the Japanese have gone through with a replacement program in the 1930s, and how could you see the US Navy perceiving them as a threat? Well, the replacement program had the kibosh put on it by Japan acceding to the first London Naval Treaty. I don't think just having these instead of the Kongos would change that. The Japanese are probably still going to sign up to it, which means the Kongo class replacements aren't going to go ahead, even for these 12-inch Kongos. They are, however, going to get a very thorough modernization, because with 12-inch guns, especially pre-World War I 12-inch guns, any argument that the Kongos could be regarded in any way, shape, or form as battle line units by the late 1930s has pretty much gone by the wayside. And yes, I know Arkansas still exists, but look at the US Navy plans. Were they realistically expecting to put Arkansas front and center of any main battle line engagement they were expecting to fight? No. At least with the Kongos, the Japanese could argue, hey, we've got 14-inch guns, same as the Fusos and Iseis. They can still hurt things, even if they're not particularly well protected. And this design was, roughly speaking, about as well protected as a Kongo. But if it's armed with 10, 12-inch guns, it's not hurting a Colorado, it's not hurting a Nelson, it's not hurting even really a Queen Elizabeth, a Revenge, Tennessee, New Mexico, etc. These ships are, obviously 12-inch gunpowder still wreck the upper works and so forth, but the citadels and the turrets are pretty much immune to this kind of firepower. But I do think the US Navy would see them as a threat. In fact, they might even see them as more of a threat than the historical Kongo class, because, as I said, because the Kongos originally had 14-inch guns, there was a possibility of the Japanese wanting to retain them to a certain degree for the battle line, as we know that eventually they did. to a certain extent. However, a ship that's armed with 12-inch guns, definitely not going to be in the battle line. Then, if you're going to modernize it, which obviously you would, there's a lot more potential there to switch its role out completely. Much like the Italian refits, it's what you would call Q turret, the one immediately behind the funnel, is quite separated from the rest of the guns. Now, you could just do a complete replacement of the machinery, and obviously old machinery, if you're new, it's going to get faster. But if I was the Japanese and I was taking this thing with 10, 12-inch guns into hand and modernizing it, I would just go, okay, look, 10, 12-inch guns, 8, 12-inch guns, it's still not a frontline battle line unit. It would, however, make a really, really nice battle cruiser in the vein of the original battle cruiser intention, but for the modern era, or we might call it a super cruiser, something like kind of like an Alaska. Although obviously they don't know about the Alaskas yet because they haven't been conceived at that point. So you remove X turret or Q turret, sorry, the amidships turret, and you completely replace the old machinery with new. If necessary, extend the machinery spaces a little bit using the volume that's been left by removing that amidships turret, which also lighten the ship somewhat. Your essential aim is to push this ship well past 30 knots. That might be 31, 32, it depends what its hull speed is and what its hull form allows. Maybe take a leaf out of the Italian book, stick a bow extension on if necessary. But the point is generally to try and get this ship to be at least as fast as foreign cruisers, ideally as fast as your cruisers, but that latter might be a little bit too ambitious. Obviously, you're going to strip out all the casement guns as well, so fill in the hull instead, and put a huge secondary battery, because obviously you've got the space, either deck space or whatever, where the casements were, well, probably not right next to the forward battery, but you've also now got this long space where the old amidships turret was, and the space between it and the aft two turrets. All of that deck space is available, so you could also build quite a nasty secondary gun nest in that position, going completely cross deck, maybe with a little spine in the middle to give you an elevated gun mount that can traverse port or starboard. Ideally, obviously, you'd also want to update the armour a little bit, but not necessarily too much, because an 8-inch belt is pretty good, unless, of course, you end up with a Hiei-style point-blank range engagement. But you would still want some armour upgrades. And the point of it is to basically create a gigantic, really high-speed cruiser hunter. Now, that would actually cause the US Navy quite a bit of worry, because a vessel like that is very definitely not going to be found tootling around with the battleships. It is going to be leading cruiser formations, and essentially puts the US Navy's cruisers in the same position that the German cruisers were in when the Invincibles came out in the mid-1900s. You have to reply, or you have to accept there's a very high chance that your cruisers are going to get massacred. And it does put the US in a little bit of a bind, because by treaty that something like this would be a capital ship, and if the Japanese are modernizing these things or starting the modernization program before the Second London Treaty system breaks down, the US Navy is confronted with, well, we can't build a reply cruiser to these things within the 10,000 ton limit. It's just not possible. But do we want to devote capital ship tonnage to countering these things? Probably not. I mean, on the other hand, it means the Japanese are down to a much smaller battle line, so maybe you could shake loose a little bit of tonnage, but I don't think the US Navy would really want to go for that. So the North Carolinas and South Dakotas will probably proceed as historical. The Alaska program, or something similar to it, might be significantly accelerated in the aftermath of the breakdown of Second London. But of course, you then also have the Iowas, and if the fast threat that potentially could hunt cruisers or carriers is these things with 12-inch guns, do you necessarily need to go as far with the Iowas as they historically did? Now, there are other reasons for building the Iowas as well, separate to the threat of the Congos. But instead of building 4 Iowas, you may perhaps see the US authorizing 2 Iowas to respond to what they think are Yamato and Musashi's specifications, and perhaps with the tonnage left over from that, from not doing the other two Iowas, maybe they do 3 Alaska or Super Alaska types with a bit more armour to try and counter these things. Seb Dove asks, my parents live near what was HMS Ganges, and I was wondering if you could tell us some of the history about the base and any notable stories from the base's history. So the story of HMS Ganges starts off with this ship, HMS Ganges herself, second ship of that name, and she was a 2-decker, 84-gun ship of the line built shortly after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. But after almost half a century of service in the 1860s, the Royal Navy was no longer really in the business of just signing people up randomly at the dockside or sending people out as a press gang to make up the numbers. You wanted a more professional career Navy, and that meant you had to train people. And if you were going to train people, that meant you needed training centres. And it was decided that the quickest and easiest way of establishing training centres, rather than building big facilities on shore, although that would eventually happen, was to just take some old ships you didn't need anymore on the front lines and turn them into floating training centres. And one of those selected was HMS Ganges. Now, one of the advantages of this was that because it was still a ship, it could be moved around. So she was initially based in Cornwall, but then as population density in the UK changed and there weren't so many recruits from Cornwall, they could just move the ship and therefore move their entire training establishment, which they did through a series of manoeuvres, eventually ending up at a place called Shotley in the very southeastern corner of Suffolk. Then at the start of the 20th century, the original Ganges went off to do other things, but now the name was associated with its training establishment rather than a specific ship, and so other ships began to be renamed HMS Ganges as they took her place at this now established training place. And that included, old ironclads, old corvettes, etc., etc. And because it was a training establishment now rather than a specific vessel, you could see multiple ships carrying the name Ganges. So there'd be a Ganges, Ganges 2, Ganges 3, etc. So if you look at some people's old records and you might see, HMS, whatever name in this case, Ganges 1, 2, 3, etc., what you're looking at is it's a training establishment with multiple old ships serving as the collective establishment, and the 1, 2, 3, etc. just basically means which particular hull they're assigned to. In the latter part of the 1920s, it was decided to move the name HMS Ganges ashore. There would still be ships, but now they would be subordinate, so Ganges 2, Ganges 3, etc. The main HMS Ganges was now going to be this shore establishment that had previously just been Shotley naval training establishment. And then she continued to serve as an early recruiting, initially boys, later obviously teenagers, training establishment up until the mid-70s, when it was decided to close Ganges, and the role that she took up as a training establishment was transferred to HMS Raleigh, another shore establishment, which ironically enough was all the way back in Cornwall again. Ash the Lego Guy asks, I recently saw a photograph taken of USS Yorktown on its trials, achieving 17.5 knots going full astern. Aside from the obvious maximum speed, various turning radii at various speeds, manoeuvrability at low speed, and various kinds of gun accuracy, what were some of the wilder trials that ships were put through that would have been very unlikely but not impossible to experience in action? And out of curiosity, what is the fastest speed a warship in the period the channel covers has ever been measured going in full reverse? There were all sorts. There were endurance trials for some ships, so they just ramp everything up to the maximum power output and go charging off into the high seas to see essentially how long can we run things before something dramatically breaks. That, of course, believe it or not, in action is not particularly likely, precisely because if something breaks, which something inevitably will, you could be left in a combat situation or near combat situation in a semi-crippled state. So, high-speed pursuits could and did happen. Look at the pursuit of Bismarck, for instance. However, even those didn't tend to last quite as long as some of the endurance trials, which could last for days and go through most of a ship's fuel supply. One of the other slightly more interesting ones, which can be a little bit worrying if you come across non-contextualized photos, is what you can see happening here to good old Emperor of India, inclining trials. And this was essentially to see what would happen if you made the ship go over at a certain angle of heel. And this could, in theory, be done by flooding various tanks lower down in the ship, but very early on, some enterprising individual figured out, well, actually, to make the ship heel, we just need to move mass from one side of the ship to the other. Well, we have a bunch of movable mass that doesn't involve complicated tank flooding and so forth, or at least minimizes it. It's called the crew. And so you'd get all the crew to run to one side of the ship, and, well, if you've got over 1,000 men on board, collectively, that's, at least 100 tons. And then you combine that with a little bit of tank flooding and some moving around of stores, and maybe get the men to carry some stuff with them to add up the overall weight, and suddenly your ship will start to heel. And then you can hold it there and go, okay, that's what happens at that angle of heel. What happens if we go a bit further? Now, with some ships, you could also increase the angle of heel by creating resonance, by basically getting people to run back and forth across the deck. But as ships got larger and larger and larger, the effect of, 600, 800, 1,200 men running back and forth becomes somewhat less than, if you've got 800 men running back and forth over Emperor of India's deck, their overall effect on the ship is going to be somewhat less than if you have 800 men running back and forth across HMS Victory's deck, for instance. And obviously, if you were in this kind of situation in combat, and it's not just a roll because, the ship is rolling in the high seas, if you're fixed at this angle of list, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. You've been torpedoed or taken massive shell damage. You're probably not long for this world if you're in combat and you have reached this stage. One of the interesting side notes, actually, is that this kind of combination of moving crew and onboard mass and flooding tanks was also very useful for another reason, which you can actually see in this photo. So look at the waterline of Emperor of India, and you'll notice all the growth, and if this was colour, you'd probably also see some rust and so forth. And so if a ship wanted to clean up its waterline and the immediate area below, one of the things they would do is this kind of inclination exercise, and then they could send people down over the side to the now exposed area where they could clean it, paint it, inspect it, etc. Then you'd haul them up, and then get the ship tilted the other way and repeat the exercise, and that way you could treat the most affected portion of the ship by marine growth and rust, without having to get the ship entering into a dockyard. In wartime, it was also a very easy way of checking for shell, splinter, and later in World War II bomb damage without the ship having to go into a dry dock. Obviously, it only works down to a certain depth, but probably the most important areas being covered. And this kind of exercise is actually what leads to, in some respects, to some of the slightly nuttier conspiracy theories surrounding the war in the Mediterranean. You have a small core of mostly Italians who insist that Giulio Cesare hit Warspite badly at or below the waterline, and their evidence is that by the time everybody else got back from the Battle of Calabria, Warspite looked pretty much like Emperor of India does now. And they're like, well, you see, this is evidence that she was in the middle of capsizing. Well, one, she made the fastest run to Alexandria, which is not something you do when you have a massive great socking hole in the side of your ship. And two, Admiral Cunningham's own biography reveals exactly what they were doing, which is that they hadn't been hit, but they had been repeatedly bombed and had some shells land close by. And so they were doing this as an effort to check out, do we actually have any small holes or other damage at or below the waterline? And then everyone else showed up and saw Warspite heeling over, like, oh, why is that? And Cunningham just went, yep, we're checking the ship. Oh, okay, fine, carry on. But some people have taken that out of context. In terms of the fastest speed of a warship going in reverse, unfortunately, I don't know that, but I suspect the answer is probably going to be a destroyer, because they're small, they're light, they're designed for speed anyway, they've got a very high power to weight ratio. usually have relatively fine sterns, which is going to help. And of course, being quite small, they are very unlikely to have dedicated reversing engines and so forth. It's far more likely you just put the main engines into reverse mode, which proportionally is going to provide a bit more power than on some larger vessels. So I would suspect something like maybe one of the big French contre-torpilleurs, but I'm unfortunate to say I don't know for certain. Daniel Silverthorne asks, was there anything resembling a uniform for the Royal Navy, or the English Navy before it, during the 14th to 17th centuries? And if so, can you show me some or recommend resources for it? And if not, what might have been typical? Unfortunately, there really wasn't. 14th, 17th centuries, 1300s to the 1600s, so up to 1699. The first official uniforms for Royal Navy officers came about in the middle of the 1700s, i.e. the 18th century, and regular crew didn't get a standardized uniform until well into the 19th century. So therefore, there aren't really any sources for a uniform that didn't exist. Now, some people have argued that a form of uniform existed for some of the Royal Navy officers prior to the 1740s, 1750s, in as much as there were certain symbols of office, whether that be some kind of scepter or sword or badge of office or something, that the really high ranking officers like the Lord High Admiral or something might wear or carry, but emphasis on the might. And also, if you've got a handful of small identifying symbols for some of your very highest ranking officers, but otherwise they can dress pretty much however they like, that is not a uniform any more than your ID card, if you happen to have one in your job, is a uniform. Or for that matter, if you see a really old veteran, scarce as they are now, from the Second World War, if they might have their rank epaulets on a civilian suit jacket or an adapted one, or medals, or perhaps a hat that indicates in some way what their original unit and rank was, they're not wearing a uniform, are they? They're wearing an identifier that tells you who they are and what they used to do, but that is not a full uniform. That is just a badge or a cap or an epaulet or whatever. In much the same way, if I wear my great-grandfather's World War I greatcoat with his medal bars obviously on the right-hand side, that's not me wearing a uniform. The only real uniform-ish argument that could really be made is that captains, admirals, whoever, officers of rank would be expected to in some way distinguish themselves from the regular crew, so they would be wearing fancier gear, but exactly what those fancier clothes were would be entirely down to them. Some more practical captains might have similar clothing to the crew so that they could help work the ship. It just might be slightly better made. And then they have, some fancy silk brocade thing or something for formal occasions. Others would look like they'd stepped out of the royal court or something like that, and perhaps be incredibly impractical for sea service, but you very definitely knew who they were, or if you didn't know exactly who they were, you at least knew they were someone of significant rank. And fashions came and went as well, with, groggum cloaks becoming a fashionable item in the Royal Navy for a while. But essentially, you're pretty much looking at a mixture of what was high fashion for the aristocracy at that particular time period, perhaps mixed in amongst more practical-minded officers with what variation on that might make some form of practical seawear. Leon Wu asks, in your July Patreon Q&A, you talked about a Canadian attempt to fund 3 battleships that came to naught. So what would have happened if that money had been spent not on British battleships, but on the Canadian Navy, as the Liberal opposition said that they wished? Well, one of the easier off-the-shelf solutions would be to take Admiral Fisher's fleet unit concept and just say, okay, we're buying a fleet unit for the Royal Canadian Navy, because 35 million Canadian dollars, about £7 million at that point in time, would roughly pay for a period fleet unit. So that would be a Tiger-type battle cruiser, 3 C-class cruisers, maybe the late production Town class, the Weymouth subclass, half a dozen destroyers, maybe a few submarines, and there'd be a little bit of cash left over to upgrade some port facilities to handle both the size of the fleet and the individual size of some of the ships, particularly the battle cruiser. So yeah, for $35 million, £7 million, you could probably just about get a nice little fleet unit for the Canadian Navy, which of course would also give the Canadian Navy a little bit of bragging rights because they now have a fleet unit, so do the Australians, but by buying theirs almost half a decade down the line, the Canadians have got a substantially more powerful one. There isn't really much point in the Canadians buying 3 battleships for themselves outright, because for the Royal Canadian Navy itself, other than just, sailing across the Atlantic and showing up for the Grand Fleet, which is pretty much what the original proposal was, the Royal Canadian Navy as it exists in the immediate pre-World War I period doesn't have anywhere near the escorts to form a fleet around 3 battleships, nor do they have any particular need for 3 battleships in and of themselves, whereas, a battle cruiser to patrol the Canadian eastern seaboard, perhaps send one of the cruisers and a couple of destroyers over to the western seaboard and keep the other 2 and the 4 destroyers and the subs to escort the battle cruiser. That's actually a pretty good coastal defense force for the Canadians. It's got the speed to patrol the distance that it needs to go, and it's got the firepower to destroy basically anything that's likely to show up. Zuranami asks, why are the positions of the 2 fire control systems swapped on the Baltimore class relative to every other US Navy ship built around that time? The preceding Wichita and the following Oregon City class have the larger rangefinder up high with the Mark 37 mounted lower, but the Baltimores have the Mark 37 on top. It's not entirely unique, actually. If you look at the Cleveland class and the Atlanta class, which are approximately contemporaneous with the Baltimores, they also have the Mark 37 as the highest mounted fire control system, or, director for the fire control system. With Wichita, she predates the Mark 37, and with Oregon City and the Alaskas and others, they have a slightly different configuration. But you've got to remember that the Mark 37 is an all-purpose system. Yes, it is primarily used for the direction of 5-inch guns in an anti-aircraft role, but it's also capable of being used as a surface gunnery action unit. And in that time period of the Alaskas being completed and the Clevelands and the Baltimores being built, the Mark 37 is brand new. So given that you have not as many of these systems aboard, because they're cruisers, you can't fit the multiple fire control systems to the degree you can on a battleship, you need to give your anti-aircraft fire control systems as broad a scope as possible. And in this case, that means mounting it as high as humanly possible so that they've got the greatest arc. And then your secondary rangefinders, etc., which they're not really secondary, but they're for your main battery guns. If you have a separate fire control system for your main battery guns, which obviously destroyers and so forth wouldn't, then you can mount them just a fraction lower. But if you look at older ships that have occasionally perhaps been retrofitted with a Mark 37, well, of course, they will have had different priorities because surface gunnery was a lot more of a priority back then, and also surface and anti-aircraft rangefinders and directors were very separate roles. And also, the Mark 37 weighs a fair bit. So if you're retrofitting it onto a ship that wasn't designed to have it in the first place, you don't necessarily want to stick it massively, massively high up, because that could adversely affect stability. And when it comes to this kind of thing, every foot counts. When you get into later vessels, for one thing, the Mark 37s become even heavier because they're sticking more radar on top of it, and it is eventually also being superseded, plus other separate radars, which are individually much lighter, can do air search and to a certain extent direction quite well, so it makes sense to have those up higher, and your increasingly heavy Mark 37s can be placed somewhat lower. At least that is what seems to make sense to me based on the timelines of the introduction of the Mark 37, the various US Navy ship classes that are built with it, and their relative positions thereof, and my reading of books like Friedman's US Cruisers. If anyone has any additional details they'd like to add, please do so in the comments below. Robert Henry Ilston asks, in multi-barrel turrets, was there a specific order in which each barrel was fired if the ship was firing in sequence or ripple firing as opposed to simultaneously firing? And related, what nomenclature did each major navy in World War I and World War II have for designating each barrel in a multi-barrel turret? As far as designating barrels within a turret went, it was very ad hoc. I mean, you'd have the more obvious ones like AB, 1, 2, left, right for twin turrets, left, center, right, ABC, 1, 2, 3, etc. for triple turrets, and so on and so forth. But for as far as I've been able to determine, there doesn't seem to have generally been a universally adopted designation system, or at least if there was one, it was pretty much ignored for the most part in general service. I mean, if you go onto the various museum ships, especially the battleships, you'll see that the crew tended to just name the various barrels according to their own personal preferences. And to be perfectly honest, about the only time it mattered would be if you had a specific breech arrangement that perhaps differed for left and right hand guns, or even for a center gun or something like that, whereas if it was completely interchangeable, it didn't really make too much odds. Now, in terms of a specific order in which each barrel was fired, if you're firing in sequence, well, there's two stages to that. If you're simultaneously firing, then usually the turret, if you're talking about at least a triple turret, you'd aim to fire the left and right hand side guns first, because that would induce just a little bit of rotation with the recoil, which would then mean that hopefully the two would cancel out and the center gun would then fire still dead and true, or you could fire the center gun and then the two outer guns. But if, say, for example, you were doing salvo firing on a US standard type battleship, and you were obviously therefore doing 4-gun salvos, so you can do 1 gun from each turret if you want, and therefore you can get 3 staggered salvos in fairly short order, there doesn't really seem to have been any particular universally agreed upon order to do things in, because obviously if you fire 3 guns, that's a whole turret. So if you've got 3 or 4 triple turrets, this is fantastic. You can fire 1 turret at a time, but 3 shots is generally just a little bit under what you really want for salvo firing for range finding. Ideally, you want 4. Now, for Richelieu, King George V, Dunkirk, Strasbourg, fantastic. We've got quad turrets, great. But for everybody else, this is a bit of a complication, because then, as I say, you could either fire 1 barrel from each turret if you have 4 triples, but if you have 3 triples, you're in a bit of a problem, because then do you fire 4 guns, so 1 turret and a gun, and then fire 5 guns, the other 2 barrels, and another turret? Do you fire 2 in 1 turret and 1 in each other of the others, and then fire 2 from each of the others and 1 from the remaining one? Do you just accept that you're just firing 3-gun salvos? And if you've got 4 twins, like Bismarck or Hood, then do you fire the forward 2 turrets and then the rear 2 turrets? Do you fire 1 gun from each turret and then 1 gun, the other gun from each turret? Do you fire your lower 2 turrets and then your upper 2 turrets? There are various ideas promulgated throughout various fleets, but as I said, there isn't ever really one universal solution where everyone goes, this is the obvious one. I mean, there's going to be a certain degree of situational need, because if your enemy is in front of you, you can't fire your rear turrets, so you would then need to adopt some pattern using just your forward turrets. And you might also have to be changing things on the fly, because even if you have a full broadside, you might have 1 or more guns or even a turret that's unable to fire for whatever reason at the time of a particular salvo, so you have to very quickly adjust in those circumstances. So you might find in a particular navy for a particular turret layout a specific doctrine for a few years, but they don't really seem to last, and they're certainly not fleet-wide, because, well, practically no navy of any significant size actually has a universal turret setup in its battleships. Red Ranger asks, if in the aftermath of a battle a ship required more people for damage control, for plugging holes, putting out fires, etc., and they happened to have prisoners of war in their brig, how likely would they be to be recruited in these efforts at all? There is, of course, variation between navies, but the single greatest variation is actually just simply by time, because what constitutes damage control in older vessels and what constitutes damage control in newer vessels and the corresponding vulnerabilities and also culture varies quite considerably. And so if you were in an age of sail vessel, for example, and you had some prisoners, and there was a really bad storm or a battle, as you say, and for whatever reason there's water pouring into the ship, maybe there's some fires as well, there's a direct, evident existential threat to everybody aboard. That includes the prisoners of war. And what you're being asked to do is essentially to help save yourself. You either help put out the fire before it spreads to the magazine, or you bail water, or you hold some planking in place, etc. I mean, you have to be in a pretty bad state where several hundred crewmen on a ship of the line aren't enough, and you have to start resorting to asking the prisoners to help as well. But this is where culture comes in as well. The prisoners, most of the time, will have surrendered on honourable terms. And so if you say to them, well, look, either you help or we all die, they'll probably help. And apart from anything else on ships of that period, there's not really that many places to hide or run off to either. You can even see this in the aftermath of the Battle of Trafalgar with some of the captured ships, where everybody was kind of pitching in to try and keep the ships from going down, with varying degrees of success for the most part. As time goes on, however, and you start to get into the ironclad and then steel and dreadnought periods, it becomes less and less likely, because for one thing, you're proportionally, the number of prisoners you're likely to have on board is going to be considerably less than the overall crew compared to what you might have as a prisoner haul in the age of sail. Secondly, there's a lot more places for prisoners to sneak off to and hide and make mischief later on. Thirdly, the kind of catastrophic damage where you might call prisoners in on an age of sail ship is probably just going to outright have sunk a steel ship. And so if there is recoverable damage, you are very unlikely to need a relatively small number of prisoners of war to try and help you, especially because damage control has become, to a certain extent, a lot more specialized. Now, of course, you can train everyone to a degree in damage control, but in the age of sail, for example, if there's catastrophic flooding, the idea of grab this bucket and throw water over the side, or here's a pump, start pumping for one of the ship's main pumps or something, that's kind of a universal given. Whereas in, say, World War II, well, this is a particular voltage electrical system on this frequency and phase, and, to bypass a damaged section, we use these cables, and this is a portable generator or a portable pump. That's really something that is going to require a degree of training which the prisoners from another navy almost certainly aren't going to have. And even if they have equivalent training, it's going to be on different systems. So you're going to waste more time telling people what you need them to do and how to do it, which they will probably then end up doing imperfectly anyway, as compared to just getting on with a job. Plus, of course, as I said, cultures have changed, so you might have taken these people prisoner, but in the First or Second World War, there, especially the Second, there might well be much more of an expectation on that prisoner for them to, if they are offered a way out of being held prisoner, to sneak off and do catastrophic damage to your ship, like trying to set off the magazines or something, which, whilst some people might try and do that in the age of sail, it was much, much less likely because of the culture of honourable surrender that surrounded that time period. Plus, there's also just sheer practicality. On an age of sail ship, if something's gone catastrophically wrong, either the prisoners are in your direct line of sight or they're one deck up or down, and you can just go, hey, look, you there, traverse the 20-30 yards, get over here and help. Whereas on a dreadnought or a cruiser, for example, the prisoners might be 3 decks away, several hundred feet, multiple bulkheads and hatches and doors and so forth. if you even bother to remember where they are at all. So just the practicalities of summoning them is not really a thing, as opposed to, hey, you who knows roughly what you should be doing, who's 20 feet away from me and belongs to the same navy, you come and help here. Jack Ray asks, how does one convert Builder's old measurement, tons burthen, to modern ship displacement? And could you give a bit more history on the way ship size was measured? Well, on old ships, like sailing ships, for example, you could have, if you just look at, say, length, 3 primary measures. You could have the length of the ship at the waterline, but of course, back in those days, especially with bowsprits and stern galleries angling out quite far, that wouldn't necessarily reflect the full length of the ship. So you'd have a waterline length, you'd have an overall length, which would be, say, from the furthest aft point of the stern to the furthest forward part of the bow. That's the structure of the ship. And then sometimes you'd also have a measurement which variously has different designations, but sometimes called between points, which is essentially the furthest aft element of the ship, period, to the furthest forward element of the ship. Now, aft, that's usually still the stern, although in the case of these Tudor-era ships, that might also be this aft sprit, if you like, that's going back, and then would be, all the way to the tip of the bowsprit. So that's some of the measurements. Then, of course, beam is maximum beam. You can also have beam at the waterline, because they may not necessarily be the same thing. And then you have different measurements brought in the age of steel. So waterline length is still a measurement that's very commonly used. Then you've got overall, which will be bow to stern, but you can also have other measurements, like the measurement from, if you're going underwater, from the bow to the propellers, just where the hull starts to rise up sharply because the propellers and rudders are in the way. That's another measurement. Now, in terms of converting tons burthen into ship displacement, there isn't really a way of doing that for 2 broad reasons. Firstly, there are quite a few different ways of calculating tons burthen, which varied both by country and by time period, because originally it wasn't really a way about measuring the actual displacement of a ship. It was about measuring the cargo capacity of a ship to work out how much you had to tax it when it came in. But also, even if you are looking at one specific way of measuring tons burthen and trying to compute that into the more modern standard or normal ship displacement or whatever, your other problem is that most of the systems rely on some variant of length, breadth, and beam, multiplied potentially in some areas by different factors and then divided through by another factor. But ships' profiles are very different through time, and obviously also even in specific time periods. So your measurement of calculation, if you were using tons burthen on, say, a frigate, a fairly long, slim vessel, or T-clipper, if we're looking at the 19th century, would yield a figure that is perhaps closer to what we would today consider to be the ship's displacement, because the relatively fine lines, especially at the bow and stern, would mean relatively little volume outside of the cargo carrying area, which is largely what tons burthen is supposed to calculate, whereas a somewhat more stoutly, more heavily built ship, like a big galleon or a first-rate ship of the line, which tends to be considerably broader both astern and forward, will have a tons burthen figure which is actually quite far removed from a modern ship displacement figure. But outside of extremes, although again there is no universal way of converting such things, if you look at, generally speaking, the tons burthen compared to modern tons displacement, where such figures have been calculated for historical ships, which isn't really too many, there is a general pattern that emerges with most figures lying somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 multiplier, with a lot of them in kind of just above the 1.5 multiplier region. So at that point, if you are looking to convert, you could say, approximately speaking, if you take a ship's tons berthen figure and multiply it by 1.5, that's going to land you in the ballpark of what its displacement figure is going to be. I personally, on the channel, tend to use 1.6, which is a little bit higher, but that's because 1.6 represents a fuller ship structure, which, when you're talking about tons berthen versus displacement, is perhaps a slightly more accurate figure for big warships, first rates, second rates, third rates, that kind of thing. So if I'm looking at something like a race-built galleon or a small frigate or a sloop or something, I might use 1.5 because that's more likely to be accurate. But if I'm talking about a major warship, a big traditional galleon or HMS Victory or something like that, where there isn't a displacement figure already available, I'll tend to use 1.6. But I emphasize this is a rule of thumb. It will give you an approximate result, but you cannot say, because this ship is 1,000 tons berthen, it is precisely 1,600 tons displacement. Its displacement is more likely to be somewhere between 1,450 and 1,650 tons. And you're not really, without very complex calculation software, gonna know, and a hull model for that matter, gonna know exactly what figure would be correct. J. Mace asks, during World War II, when the British were arming merchant ships to defend convoys due to the lack of escorts, were there battle tactics for how these armed merchant ships could coordinate to stand up to a small number or just one enemy warship? Or was the plan just for these weapons to be used to slow down enemies while merchant ships made a run for it? Well, there's two phases to this. There's the general arming of merchant ships with one or two guns. That didn't have any particular tactics associated with it. Those guns were there essentially to give them an opportunity to fight back against a U-boat that had surfaced or a hostile enemy vessel that might not be particularly armed. Because bear in mind, in the First World War, German armed merchant cruisers or armed merchant raiders had been something of a thorn in the Royal Navy's side, and of course in World War II they were the Hilfskreuzer, although they were much more heavily armed and much better organised as a whole. And so the thought was, by having a minimum standard of resistance, at least across a fair number of merchant ships, it would force any attempts at small-scale raiding by the Axis powers to at least put a degree of effort into it, which of course would limit the number of potential raiders that were available, plus the aforementioned U-boat defence, and then later on a small degree of anti-aircraft defence. But there wasn't really any official plans for various merchant ships that might have a 3 or 4 inch gun or an Oerlikon or something to work together against a particular threat. If it happened, great. If a convoy commander instructed you to try that, great. But nothing particularly in place that was like, oh yeah, if a Admiral Hipper class cruiser shows up, then all 30 ships in the convoy should try and deluge him with small caliber fire or something like that. The slight difference was, of course, where you had armed merchant cruisers like the Rawalpindi, which were much more extensively armed, and unlike other ships, which were just supposed to offer at least a certain degree of resistance, with the armed merchant cruisers, they were supposed to actually properly safeguard the convoy. So, of course, if there was a U-boat, they could deliver considerably more firepower to them. But something like Rawalpindi would be, or Jervis Bay for that matter, would be expected to be able to go toe-to-toe with something like a Hilfskreuzer and at least hold it off or drive it off, if not necessarily win. If there was an actual warship, and bearing in mind for something like the Atlantic, that would necessitate the ship having some range, so it was going to be at least a cruiser, if not more. No one expected armed merchant cruisers to be able to defeat a Hipper or a Deutschland or a Scharnhorst in straight-up combat, but again, as with the examples of Rawalpindi and Jervis Bay, they could at least provide something of a speed bump which would allow the majority of the convoy to escape. Although exactly how they provided that speed bump was to a certain degree left up to the commanders, because it was realised that yes, you could go all in headlong at an enemy capital ship like some of these ships did, but that was essentially suicide. And the Royal Navy was not in the business of telling the captains explicitly, you must commit suicide to preserve the convoy. So there was a certain amount of leeway. For example, in that kind of circumstance, if the convoy was scattering, you could kind of fall back as a rear guard of the convoy and offer distracting fire, or potentially even pretend to be a merchant ship, which would hopefully sucker them into close range where your guns could actually have some degree of effect. All of these were open options, but of course, if you were too good at pretending you were a regular merchant ship, then the enemy ship might go after other ships in the convoy first, and you wouldn't be able to do anything about it, which is why, in those famous cases and in one or two others, the armed merchant cruiser captains chose to identify themselves and go headlong to give the other ships as much time as possible. Chief Eyeroll asks, during World War II, when using torpedoes prepared to fire, was there a significant difference in launch times after the command to fire was given between the various combatants, and why? If ships were caught by surprise, was there a significant difference between the combatants to prepare themselves for firing torpedoes, and again, why? If everything was prepared, then no, there wouldn't be a substantial difference in launch time after the command to fire was given. But that's assuming they are prepared, because there's a lot of stuff going into being prepared to fire that might change things, even if the ship isn't caught by surprise. So, for example, in above-water torpedo launchers, there are some which use compressed air to fire the torpedoes and use a black powder charge as a backup. Other torpedo launchers still use black powder charges. Now, both of those can have different elements involved. So, obviously, the building up of pressure and then the release of compressed air to launch a torpedo using that system may take slightly longer to get ready if the tanks aren't fully charged, whereas with a black powder charge, press a button or pull a trigger or a lanyard and off it goes, but you might not necessarily be keeping the black powder charges in the launchers at all times, so you might have to go and find the thing and insert it. And likewise with aiming, because it might just be a fairly simple launch at this bearing and off it goes. You might want it to go out and have a gyro setting that will then turn it on a particular bearing. Is this all being worked out on the bridge using, if you look at a lot of preserved museum ships, particularly destroyers, using calculating devices based on the bridge, and is that being then just passed down and told this is what you need to do, or are they telling the torpedo launch crew, hey, there's that ship over there, I want you to get a solution on that ship? And then, of course, the people with the equipment on the torpedo launchers have to work it all out. And, of course, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, certain torpedo launchers might have different training speeds, for example. I mean, obviously, a quintuple launcher is going to weigh a lot more than a twin or a triple launcher, but then the twin or triple launcher might be older and might not have actually proportionally quite as powerful a motor. So your big quad and quintuple torpedo launchers may or may not turn faster than your twin or triple launchers. And there are going to be different bearings which those launchers can or can't fire on. So if it's an open deck launcher on a destroyer, it's probably got quite a wide angle of fire. If it's a below deck launcher on a cruiser, it's going to have a more limited arc of fire. But then you might want the ship to turn, or you might launch the torpedo, as we said earlier, with a gyro setting to try and overcome that. If you're in a sub, you've got to flood the tube as a preparatory measure, which on a destroyer you wouldn't have to. And similarly, you've also got to open the doors on a submarine, which again, on a surface ship, you generally don't have to. But normal procedure would call for the torpedo launchers, if you wanted to aim at a particular ship, to report themselves ready before you gave the order to fire. So once you gave the command to fire, there shouldn't be really all that much delay. If, on the other hand, as you mentioned in the second part, they're caught by surprise, then usually it is slightly slower to ready a submarine's torpedoes, because you have essentially the same set of circumstances of, okay, prepare the launcher to fire, but what does that entail? On a surface ship launcher, that involves training the launcher out. Then you have to input the data from your torpedo computer or from whatever ranging and measuring device you're using. But then with a surface launcher, that's it. You're now ready to go. With a submarine launcher, of course, as we mentioned, you potentially have to maneuver the submarine considerably more unless you're going to do complex gyro work. And you have to flood the tube and open the doors, and all of that takes time. Plus, you've got to move water into the tank and get the compressed air ready so that that water and the compressed air can then propel the torpedo out, whereas on a surface launcher it should theoretically already be prepared and ready to go, or very quickly can be remedied. And then of course there are shortcuts, because you might not necessarily skip certain of those steps, but you might have certain of those steps already done. So you might be surprised, but you might have been expecting a surprise, if that makes sense. So you might be patrolling hostile waters and thinking, well, there's a chance we might come across a hostile ship. When that hostile ship shows up, it might be a surprise in and of itself, but you might have already done a bunch of those steps, at which point only really inputting the launch data will be necessary before you actually launch. But as a result, you could end up with a submarine where it being surprised might be really quick off the mark in getting a torpedo in the water, but equally you might have a destroyer with a triple launcher that is surprised, and if the crew is half a ship away asleep, getting that thing ready to fire in the event of a complete surprise attack might actually take considerably longer than the submarine that was kind of on a hair trigger. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, you've explained what Great Eastern could look like as a warship, but how effective would she be as a block ship? Well, there's two potential terminologies for block ship, but actually in both cases, outside of some niche circumstances, she'd be pretty terrible. So you've got block ship as in a ship that is used to block the entrance to an enemy harbour by sinking itself in it. Or you've got block ship in the use that would have been somewhat more common in her time period, which is a ship that is used essentially as what we would term a harbour defence vessel. So she's able to move around and potentially move to other harbours, but her general duties are to be in a particular harbour and to act as the defence ship for that harbour. And as I say, in both cases she'd be pretty terrible. She's huge and relatively therefore unwieldy, which means that trying to position her in such a way that she could actually block a harbour entrance would be incredibly difficult, and also she's hardly a stealthy vessel. They're gonna see her coming. Now, as I said, in both cases there are caveats. The only caveat to the blocking of the enemy channel or harbour vessel use would be she does have propellers and paddle wheels. And the paddle wheels, in theory, should allow her to rotate pretty much on the spot. So either by sheer size, if the channel isn't that big, so perhaps it's a harbour entrance or channel that typically she couldn't actually fit into, just run into that, great, fantastic, now it's blocked. But that's likely to be a fairly small one, so a harbour, so are you going to really expend such a massive ship to block what is probably a relatively inconsequential harbour? Or the alternative is, if it's a bigger one, sail her into the channel as if she was on normal approach, then stop and just use the paddles to rotate 90 degrees, and then there you go, job done. That potentially could work, and she's probably big enough, if you were going to use her in that manner, to absorb a fair amount of firepower while she's doing it, assuming the paddle wheels don't get destroyed. As a harbour defence vessel, again, probably pretty terrible because of her size. She's not going to be able to manoeuvre freely around most harbours. She's also going to take a while to get going in any one particular direction, which could be a problem because it's also going to take a while for her to stop. So lurching around confined waters, not really something you'd want to do with a ship like this. Conversely, however, if you're not relying too much on her propulsion other than to get her from point A to point B in times of peace, and then mostly staying fairly static as a harbour defence vessel, in that role she could actually be relatively successful, because if you have a relatively narrow harbour entrance or approach, or a specific arc of fire you need to cover, she's big enough you could put an absolutely massive battery of guns on her, moor her in such a position that she has cover to that area you want to defend, and then she just doesn't have to move unless or until you want to put her in a different harbour or a slightly different position, because essentially at that point she's a static fortress that just happens to be instant fortress, just add ship, without the faff of having to go around and actually construct land-based fortifications and so forth. So if you suddenly are like, this port nearby, maybe even, let's say, a Grand Harbour in Malta, is suddenly considerably less well defended than we'd like. If you look at the Grand Harbour entrance, it's not the biggest. Then you could potentially go, okay, well, we're just going to sail a massive gun battery based on the Great Eastern, and we're just going to moor it here to one side inside the harbour, and then if anything tries to come through the entrance, it's very, 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 very stuffed, because we have like half the firepower of the British Empire aimed at it on this colossal harbour defence vessel. Capitano Lorenzo asks, at one period of time covered by your channel, the Spanish Royal Shipyard of Havana, Cuba, was the peer equivalent of many of the finest shipbuilding yards in the world. From my quick reading, between 1765 and 1789, Havana built approximately 65 ships, 5 of which were first-class ships of the line, and a number of them were made out of mahogany, no less. But I heard they closed in 1902. What happened? The short answer is Britain happened and then America happened. So, more precisely, with the Napoleonic Wars costing the Spanish an absolute fortune, and not only with them initially siding with Napoleonic France, but then later them being occupied by Napoleonic France and having a massive land campaign fought to free them from Napoleonic France, and then their South American empire largely going, you know what, stuff this for a game of soldiers, we're independent. Spain entered the bulk of the 19th century with nowhere near the financial resources that she'd had before, because, well, all the gold and silver mines didn't belong to them anymore, and a huge amount of debt and rebuilding that they had to deal with because of the Napoleonic Wars. And with their relatively minimal empire compared to what they'd had before, by the middle of the 19th century, the Havana shipyards had fallen into significant disuse and disrepair. They'd mostly stopped constructing ships, in and around the period of the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but lack of finances and lack of need meant that from sort of 1815 to 1850, they gradually wound down. They became more of a maintenance yard than a shipbuilding yard. They did build a few ships in the 1850 period, 1850s, 1860s, and then just further degraded, essentially, just as a basic maintenance stopover. So the British Empire in the Napoleonic Wars killed the Havana shipyards as a major shipgoing concern, but they were still present. And then the Spanish-American War happened, and Cuba was ceded to the US, which then gave Cuba a limited degree of independence. But the newly formed Republic of Cuba had no particular need for a big naval dockyard, and so the dockyards were closed down and most of the land was sold. Some shipyards in Havana have subsequently been reopened, but that was the end of the line in 1902 for the direct line of operation of the Royal Shipyards of Havana. John McCarthy asks, both the US and Japan believed in long-range gunnery and invested in features to enable it, such as pagoda masts, super-heavy shells, extremely long-range guns, etc. You've argued persuasively that an opponent can maneuver to dodge an incoming salvo at extreme range. The Americans and the Japanese must have taken a different view. What was their logic? There were 2, maybe 3 main elements to the logic. One of which is that investing in long-range gunnery when it really started, different navies had different ideas of what constituted battle range prior to and during World War I, but if we go from the end of World War I onwards, the initial investment in long-range gunnery still makes a certain degree of sense, because World War I era vessels initially were capable of engaging in the high teens to maybe pushing it the very low 20s of thousands of yards, partially because the fire control systems wouldn't go much further than that, and in large part simply because the guns wouldn't elevate high enough to let you fire further than that. So if we say, or rather arbitrarily, roughly speaking 20,000 yards, but you want to engage at 25,000 yards or 27,000 yards or somewhere in between, that's entirely doable. And so investing to have your guns able to elevate higher and all the other measures you mentioned so that you can now engage further out than 21,000 yards, that makes a certain amount of sense. And there's also a degree of, well, do we want to engage at a practical distance of, let's say we want to engage at 26,000 yards. We're starting to push the envelope a little bit here, but let's say we want to do that. Do we want that to be the very, very edge of our capability, or do we want that to be comfortably inside our capability? Because there may be circumstances like shore bombardment or such like where having the additional range might help. And if, for example, your fire control systems can spot and track an enemy from, let's say, 35,000 yards, you can start refining your fire control solution quite extensively before you ever get to the point of actually having to open fire. So there's that element to it. Another element is that all the navies in the interwar period, at least all the big ones, were to varying degrees still wedded for a lot of the time to the battle line concept. And in a battle line of half a dozen or more ships, the opportunity to maneuver is significantly reduced. Because if you have a nice straight battle line and then one of your ships is fired upon and starts doing a radical turn, well, the other ships are going to be thinking, why is that ship doing a radical turn? Is it because it spotted torpedoes or a submarine nearby? What's going on? Do we need to maneuver as well? And, of course, with some of the earlier fire control systems, especially ones that have been inherited from the First World War period, some of them might not deal too well with sudden maneuvers by your own ship, so you might throw off your own fire control solution completely, at which point staying in the line, even if the enemy salvos are getting disturbingly closer and closer to a particular ship, might seem to make more sense in terms of being able to fire back and general fleet cohesion, at which point, if in theory you're having a fight at 30,000 yards, yes, in theory you could actually quite easily dodge that incoming fire, assuming that it has actually been correctly targeted at you, but other circumstances might prevent you from doing so, especially in the context of a large fleet line engagement. Of course, with the reduced number of ships and the various commitments that everybody had, the odds of having a full fleet line engagement were very much reduced, even if, especially in the Pacific, both sides were a little bit perhaps too wedded to that than was wise for a prolonged period of time. That's not to say the Royal Navy didn't also look forward to fleet line engagements. Just look at their exercises in the interwar period, which I will come back to cover in further videos at some point. But when you look at Royal Navy fleet exercises, whilst there are line engagements, there's a lot more engagements being planned for, which are either individual capital ships or 2 or 3 capital ships at a time, at which point far more maneuvering is available as an option as compared to full line battles. And the final factor here is that sometimes your enemy might not have a choice in terms of maneuvering. So, for example, actually the Battle of Samar is to a certain degree a good example of this. You can look at something like USS Johnston, which is able to dodge and weave quite a bit, albeit as the range closes, that becomes less and less of a viable dodging tactic. But when you look at the escort carriers, they are physically incapable of outrunning or even maintaining separation from the Japanese capital ships if and when they start ramping up to full speed. Now, this means that if you are trying to run while screaming for help and hoping help shows up, the only effective way of doing that is to run in a dead straight line, because you can dodge and weave, but every time you do that, you're losing speed and not travelling in the real direction you want to be, which means your enemy's going to close you down a lot faster. So obviously with a faster battle line speed, this factors a bit more into Japanese thinking than American, although with the advent of fast capital ships, it would also factor into American thinking. And even if you have a speed advantage, if you are at a disadvantage against the enemy in terms of firepower, like say you're a carrier that's been discovered by a battleship, again, ideally you want to get out of range as fast as humanly possible, which usually means just hightailing it in a dead straight line. And in those circumstances, even fire at 28, 30, 32,000 yards might still be effective, because it is ultimately still something where you could, to a certain degree, hope to hit something. As opposed to if you're talking about 2 ships with a roughly equal chance of hurting each other, slugging it out in a gun duel, or 2 or 3 ships aside, at which point, when all other things are equal, neither one is particularly running, but also not necessarily heavily closing down, then that ability to maneuver to avoid incoming firepower becomes much more relevant and therefore negates a lot of long-range gunnery. Jellicoe Cats asks, in his book Fighting the Great War at Sea by Norman Friedman, he mentions pre- or early war experiments with closed-cycle caustic soda submarine propulsion systems that piqued my interest. I've run into the concept of using the heat liberated when you mix sodium hydroxide with water to generate steam in the context of soda motor trolleys, aka trams, fielded by various transit companies after the American Civil War. The idea behind these systems was that because they produce steam without combustion, you could drive the trolley cars through tunnels and under bridges without covering everybody with soot. The soda motors worked as intended, but only for a few hours before the trolley had to return to the car barns to have the soda heated to drive off the water and regenerate the dry soda for reuse. I suspect that similar range limitations, combined perhaps with the reluctance of submariners to be trapped in a submarine with a couple of tons of pressurized drain cleaner, led to the experiments not going anywhere, but I'm interested in what they had in mind. Were these going to be one and done, you get to stay underwater until the soda is saturated coastal defence systems, or were they maybe looking to harness waste heat from air-breathing engines to recover water and regenerate the dry sodium hydroxide so they could run steam turbines underwater? This was a fun question. I had to do quite a lot of digging around for this. So when it comes to the caustic soda engines, there were actually a few working models tried pre-World War I, but at relatively low capacity. Submarines grew quite quickly, both in what they're expected to do and their overall size and therefore power requirements, so by the First World War, those early low-capacity engines didn't really have much to do with what was needed at the time, although it must also be noted that those early caustic soda engines did actually lose out to early diesel electric. In the First World War, they were discarded mainly because the extreme caustic nature of the contents of said engine required very special steels to be used in the construction of them. Otherwise, it would just eat its way out of the engine, and then, that very, very, very bad things start to happen. And it was held that, well, what supply we have of these special types of steel is needed elsewhere, so we're just going to abandon this because the amounts that we'd need for the relatively minor benefit of not having to put up with the electrical battery cells of the time, it's not really that much of an advantage. But post-World War I, they were still being looked at in preference to closed-cycle engines, where you would carry compressed or liquid oxygen aboard and feed that into diesel generators, obviously with a mix of other gases so that the pure oxygen didn't just eat the engine again. The caustic soda engine was actually held to be a better idea, but it fell over on a couple of main grounds. Obviously now they had access, more easy access at least, to the steels that they needed to build the things, but firstly, the increasing capacity of battery technology meant that although they were much more vulnerable than a caustic soda engine would be to, shock and damage and so forth, the caustic soda engine couldn't quite go as far as the electric motors and battery combination could. And secondly, once you've incorporated all the cooling systems so that you don't have to exhaust steam underwater, the other problem with the system was that when you surfaced, to answer the last part of the question, they were expecting to use conventional diesel engines or some other form of at-surface engine to produce heat to recausticify, that's not even really a word, but you get the idea, the caustic soda that was being used. But by that point, steam turbines on submarines in general, thanks to the K-class, were not really being held in a huge amount of favour, and B, you had to significantly dry out the caustic soda before you could reuse it, period, which was actually overall a net weakness, because if you were surfaced for, say, 20% of the time you needed and then you dive, you weren't really going to get a huge amount of power at all. Whereas with batteries, if you've charged to 20% power, you have 20% battery life before you need to surface again, but for that 20% of the time, you can still maneuver at speed. Whereas with the caustic soda, it was a much more gradual regeneration process that required a significant amount of time and therefore presented a potential weakness in the ability of the submarine to operate in hostile conditions. Alex Moskovitz asks, is it possible to estimate how much of the US Navy in World War II was built using steel made in Pittsburgh, And could any of that steel have ended up in the USS Requin, the museum ship currently located in Pittsburgh? Theoretically, yes, it should be possible to calculate, assuming the necessary records have survived, because each consignment of steel of different qualities, obviously armor steel, hull steel, pressure hull steel, etc., all of this is going to be to different specifications. But with that said, each consignment of steel should have records that show where it was destined for, who bought it, and theoretically you could track it to a specific shipyard and potentially even to a specific ship if you were really lucky. However, I don't know if those records have survived, and if they have, I wouldn't necessarily know where to look for them. Some of those records might still be held by steel companies if there is a contiguous, line of succession of either the same company or its successors who bought it out. And it would be an absolutely colossal amount of work, because obviously, depending on who's making it and what facilities they have, you might have steel being manufactured in just ingot form and then being sent off for forming elsewhere, or you might have steel being made to the specific shape and size that is necessary in the factory. And then, of course, let's say you can even track down, okay, pressure hulls for this particular class of submarine are being made here, then you potentially have to look at a different set of records, because if they've made a bunch of standard pressure hull cylinder sections for a particular class of submarine, then that batch may be sent to a particular yard, but then which particular units are being used on which particular submarines is another matter. Requin, of course, being built in Maine, so closer to Pittsburgh than a lot of other steel manufactories, so perhaps potentially more likely than, say, West Coast shipyards to be using Pittsburgh steel, but it's not a guarantee. So the long and short of it, yes, in theory you could track and roughly estimate how much of the US Navy was built using Pittsburgh steel, and with a lot more work you could potentially trace, I would suggest perhaps tracing backwards from the construction records of Requin rather than from all the steel produced in Pittsburgh. You could potentially trace back and find out where the steel used to build Requin came from, but I don't know where all those records are stored, and I don't know if anyone else has done that level of detailed work. So it's a theoretical possibility, but as far as I'm aware, I don't know if anyone's actually run those specific figures yet. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, was there another incident similar to how the Brazilian cruiser Bahia was lost? And could her survivor's ordeal be best compared to those who survived the loss of USS Indianapolis? In very specific terms of somebody, at least ostensibly, the current theory goes that somebody on Bahia shot her own depth charges with an anti-aircraft gun by accident and set them off, thus blowing the stern off the ship and causing it to sink quickly. I'm not aware of any other comparable similar incident. There are instances where ships were carrying mines, or indeed depth charges or torpedoes, and then when they were hit by enemy fire, those contributed to the rather rapid and spectacular disassembly of the vessel. But off the top of my head, for the time period that the channel covers, I can't recall anyone else who accidentally shot their own cargo of high explosives stacked on deck, whether that be in the form of a mine, a depth charge, or a torpedo, and then thereby destroyed their ships. There were plenty of ships that were badly damaged by their own depth charges going off prematurely after they'd been dropped, and of course some ships were damaged by the detonation depth charges of ships that they had accidentally or deliberately just sunk. And there were cases, especially in the Channel, in the war between the MTBs, MGBs, and the occasional PT boat versus the German Schnellboote, the British developed a technique of dropping shallow detonation depth charges ahead of German high-speed attack craft, which, as far as everyone can tell, did seem to account for a few of them. But all of those are either accidental but don't involve gunfire, or are deliberate actions on the part of the enemy. So the very specific nature of Bahia's loss, I don't think was replicated anywhere else in the time period the channel covers. But her survivor's ordeal, yeah, something like the loss of USS Indianapolis would be a very close comparison, where a ship goes down, leaving the survivors in with very little supplies in tropical waters infested by sharks, and nobody really notices that the ship is gone for far too long, which results in mass casualties amongst the survivors before a relatively few number are picked up. There are one or two similar events in other circumstances, but Bahia and Indianapolis would certainly be among the higher proportional casualty counts of that kind of incident. And finally, for this half of this episode of the Drydock, Kra F1 asks, how was Germany able to conduct sea trials of new and refit ships during both World Wars, particularly in World War II with Allied sea and air power? How were large vessels such as the Bismarcks able to conduct sea trials in the North Sea uninterrupted? Quite simply, they didn't. They knew that going out into the North Sea would almost certainly invite unwanted attention from something, probably a Royal Navy submarine, and so they utilised the Kiel Canal to head over into the Baltic. Indeed, both Bismarck and Tirpitz's sea trials were conducted in the Baltic, which was substantially more under Germany's control, because certainly in the early part of the war, either they weren't at war with Russia, or once they were, in that early part, the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine definitely had the upper hand in the Baltic compared to the Russian Baltic fleet. And that wraps up the first half of Drydock episode 312. Pop over to episode 312 part 2 for the rest.